Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for spending your Tuesday morning with us here at Welcome Home Coalition. And you are the Welcome Home Coalition. The majority of this audience, I think, is our members. So thank you so much all for being here. Yeah. So I'm Molly Hogan. I'm the director of the Welcome Home Coalition, and we are dozens, 66 currently organizations, many of you in this room, housing providers, homeless service providers. And thank you to folks who are not in our coalition membership that took the time to be here and learn from these amazing panelists that we brought from around the country to share what they're doing in other parts of the nation with us. I just want to invite us to set the tone for this conversation and listening today, to be really grateful for what this region has in terms of addressing the issues of a shortage of affordable housing and homelessness. Right? We have our problems for sure, but rising housing costs is a national issue. We're not alone. And you know, in the last 8 years, voters here have passed 3 measures to really address this issue. Both the affordable housing bonds have created over 800 apartments and homes than were promised to voters. And then in 2020, voters passed a marginal 1% tax on wealthy, high-income earners to help people with low incomes. Like, that is a beautiful thing. And I want us to enter this conversation being proud of our region. I feel like lately I've been in a lot of conversations where we're basing it in fear and frustration. And so let's just today, when we're learning from what folks are doing in other parts of the country and what they're doing really well, that we just think about how can we bring some of that here and how can we collaborate and celebrate our region, because it's beautiful and we all love it. That's why we live here. And we can address this issue. It's not insurmountable. We just have to change our mindset. And so learning from other folks can kind of help us shake out of our mindset that we all get stuck in as human beings, right? So that's my little spiel for setting the tone for the morning. There are note cards at tables and on your seats, and there is a basket up here. So as these panelists are speaking, if you think of a question you have for them, you can go ahead and jot the question down and raise your hand, and staff will come around and grab your note card and bring it up so we can ask it. If you want to ask a verbal question, raise your hand, tell staff, and we'll bring this mic around at the end for verbal conversation. Lastly, I want to thank the sponsors of our event. Putting on something like this costs money. We're going to feed you all lunch afterwards. So thank you to Beneficial State Bank. Thank you to Metro. Thank you to the Coalition of Communities of Color, Home Forward, Impact Northwest, and the Granville Foundation. And I'd also like to give a special thanks for folks that offered a donation when you got your ticket today. You are also deeply appreciated. So without further ado, we're going to go ahead and get our social housing models in the U.S. panel started. So while I pull up slides, I'm actually going to ask you panelists to go down the line and just introduce yourself briefly, your name, where you're coming from, and I'll pull up slides. Thanks.
Hello, good morning, everyone. My name is Camille Gicks. I use she, her pronouns. I am from Seattle, and I'm a policy researcher, specifically focused on social housing policies around the world, and was a policy advisor to Seattle's Initiative 135.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Ken Silverman. I'm the Vice President of Government Affairs at the Housing Opportunities Commission, which is the public housing authority in Montgomery County, Maryland, outside of D.C. It's my first time in Portland, and it's a beautiful city. Very happy to be here.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kaileah Baldwin. I use she, her pronouns. I am the board chair of the Seattle Social Housing Developer that was established by passage of Initiative 135 in Seattle. It's good to be here.
Good morning. I'm Helmi Hesserich. I use she, her pronouns. I am the new director of the Portland Housing Bureau, started in February. And before coming to the Portland Housing Department, I have been leading delegations to Vienna to learn about social housing, which is something I've been studying since about 2015.
Thank you so much, y'all. So Camille's going to kick us off. And just let me know when you want me to move slides, Camille.
Sounds good. Okay, so I'm starting us off because I'm going to kind of share a little bit about social housing from the 30,000-foot view, looking at a little bit of the history and how social housing has become a sort of international movement from its early days in Vienna to now, where we kind of see a lot of movements in the United States starting to pop up. So you can... Oh, this is just a really brief slide about me. I am a policy researcher. I got my graduate degree from the University of Washington in housing studies and public policy analysis, and I've also done a number of trips and delegations to Vienna, Hong Kong, and Singapore to learn about their housing models. So just to begin, I want to sort of ground us in what the definition of social housing is as practiced in the places that I have studied. So social housing is, in Seattle, when we were trying to define it for our campaign, we boiled it down into a few different ideas and topics. So it is publicly owned and financed, and we'll get a lot more into that when Ken gets to present on Montgomery County. It is available to all incomes, which is a really important component. So this is how it differs from traditional public housing in the United States. It is permanent and affordable, so people are able to maintain their affordability in perpetuity. And there are variations internationally. So like I said, I've studied Singapore, I've studied Vienna, I've studied Uruguay. Montgomery County was what I did my thesis on, so I'm very excited to hear from Ken in a little bit. And the variations are wide. They go, they can be more about land ownership versus development ownership by the public. And there's some models have more flexible income caps where there's still income caps, but they're very flexible, and other models have no income caps at all. So now to kind of, I'm gonna, just so that I am fully on track with where this timeline is going. So social housing is not a new policy. Social housing has been around for over a century. So tracing back to the Red Vienna era, which Helmi will speak a lot more on in detail. This dates back to the 1920s when Vienna was overseeing a huge change in their governance and their population, and they started to develop municipally owned housing that was available to anyone who wanted it. Then there was also, during the same period of time, a lot of other European cities were also building up their social housing stock, including Berlin and Paris. But a couple decades later, we had the United States also developing public housing in a much different way than what we know of it today. So in pre-war, public housing was very available across incomes. It was available to more of the middle class, and it was largely because of our country's history of racism that it ended up becoming what it is today, because it was defunded and made to become what we think of as slums and these sort of deteriorating public housing developments. And this was during the period of the 70s and 80s. And at the same time in the 70s and 80s, cities like Berlin and Paris started to neoliberalize, just like the United States, and sell off their social housing stock. They started to really invest in the idea of public-private partnerships, funding non-government entities to provide housing for only the extremely poor, and then rely on the market to do the rest, which has resulted in where we are today, which is so many people of middle and upper middle incomes not being able to afford rent. In the 70s and 80s as well is when the Singaporean government established their Housing Development Board, which is the most They have the highest percentage of residents living in social housing of any country in the world. Over 80% of their population lives in government-owned housing, and most of them own their units on 99-year leaseholds. And, of course, I know Ken will go more into this, but the 80s is also when Montgomery County's Public Housing Authority started to do something a little different to sort of push back against all of the neoliberalism that was existing in the rest of our country. So now, in our current era, I've spoken to a lot of people about, when I was in Vienna last, we were talking to some of their representatives about how cities in Europe, Berlin particularly, are now deeply regretting their decision to sell off so much of their social housing stock, and they are visiting Vienna on their own delegations to learn about how to reestablish their social housing models. And we are also now seeing a huge movement and increase in movements in the United States of cities and states that are trying to establish social housing models locally. So these are, of course, Seattle. We just passed our landmark citizens initiative in February of 2023. And then states like California and Hawaii and Rhode Island and Maryland, the state just passed an effort. So there's a huge growing movement nationwide from west to east coast trying to make public housing available to all people through the social housing model. So basically, long story short about this whole timeline is that social housing is very much not a new policy. This was a huge piece of rhetoric that we had to fight against in Seattle. This is not an untested idea. It is extremely tested. It is tested all over the world, on almost every single continent, and even within the United States. So just a really brief overview of what some of the different models look like, and we'll have more detail on Vienna and Montgomery County from our other panelists, but these are just the ones that I've spent time studying. So we have in Vienna, they operate largely based on public debt and a 1% payroll tax. Almost 50% of their population live in the municipally owned housing itself. More than 85% of the population can qualify for this social housing, and they have been able to maintain revenue neutrality with their financing model. The Housing Development Board in Singapore is one of the most interesting ones to me because they have built it up so that such a huge percentage of their population is living in social housing. They own pretty much 80% of the housing stock, but then individuals are able to purchase their unit, similar to a condominium, and instead of having an HOA, the HOA is the government owning the land. And then in Uruguay, theirs is much more similar to what we think of as a community land trust, but instead of nonprofits operating the community land trust, it's this, the national government owns the land, and then they have groups of, they call it mutual aid housing, where groups will come together, build their housing together with this technical assistance from the government, and then they are democratically managed within their developments. And then finally, we have Montgomery County, which has operated, at least during my research, was operating at a sort of 70-30 split of 70% more market rate housing and then 30% affordable, which from some of the research from one of my colleagues over in New York, this has resulted in actually a larger proportion of affordable housing being allocated to low-income people than we're able to do in most public housing authorities around the United States. So this is a really, really simple breakdown of how the revolving loan fund can work within a U.S. context and how we are aiming for the Seattle model to function once it's more built up. And Kaileah will talk a little bit more about how it is going since passing the initiative. But the first step in the financing process is the capital grant. So Montgomery County receives funds from their county. So unlike other public housing authorities, which rely exclusively on funds from the Housing and Urban Development Department of the United States, Montgomery County gets this less restrictive funds from their county government. They use that to issue bonds, so public bonds, which have much lower interest rates, which then they use to build their capital and then construct they can construct or acquire, and that this is, again, what we are hoping for the Seattle model, based off of the research that we did alongside folks from Montgomery County and researchers. Once residents move in, they start paying their rents just as they normally would, which are capped at 30% of their income. And those rents, because they're coming from a mix of incomes, including people at a higher end of the income spectrum, the amount of rent that they're getting is able to help service the loan that they got from issuing bonds. This also pays operations. And then over time, the loan is paid off. Once the loan is paid off, all of the rent, all of the additional money that is paid by the residents in rent goes back into a pot of money, which can then be further bonded upon and continue this sort of revolving nature of the process of financing these projects. And Ken will have a much more detailed version of this than I provide. So in Seattle, like I said, I worked on the campaign to create the Seattle Social Housing Developer. Kaileah is part of the implementation side. So as the policy advisor, we formed a coalition which was housed under the organization called Real Change, which is our street paper in Seattle. You all have Street Roots. We're very good friends with Street Roots at Real Change. And we campaigned as a citizens initiative. So we had a lot of different organizations that we bought in. We had unions, we had affordable housing providers, permanent supportive housing providers, service organizations, all sorts of backgrounds working to campaign for this. We did research over the course of about 6 to 7 months in 2021, which then led into launching our initiative and sending it to the city. We collected signatures. We spent about 5 or 6 months collecting the amount of signatures that we needed to get it on the ballot. We unfortunately missed the November ballot, which we had been aiming for, by just a little bit, and so we ended up on a special ballot in February of 2023. This was a concern for a lot of people because off-year, off-month ballots are typically not great for really new ideas, but we had a lot of belief in this model and a lot of people who were willing to give a lot of time to making it happen. And so we pushed, and we were successful at passing the initiative with a 14-point margin. We had a larger turnout of renters than had ever turned out in an off-year election in our city's history. So it was a very successful initiative, which, is now working on being implemented today.
Thank you so much, Camille.
I think that's all.
Yeah, that's it.
Thank you.
So now we're going to move over to Helmi. I'm going to pull up your slides if you want to just start talking to the crowd while I pull them up.
Sure. So good morning. I think I'll start also by sharing a little bit about my story and how I got to social housing. So I worked for 25 years in the city of Los Angeles. I served as the director of housing in the city of Los Angeles. I served as the deputy mayor of homelessness and housing in Los Angeles. And my background is actually in finance, so I'm really deep into the numbers on how do you finance affordable housing. And in about 2015, it hit me that the system that I had been working in my whole professional life was not working. That I had become an expert in a system that didn't work, and that if I continued in that continued working, I saw myself working hard, and everybody that I worked with, whether they were within the government or even or outside the government, working as advocates or developers or service providers, everybody was working their tails off, and things were getting worse. They were not improving. And I felt a sense of urgency to find a system that was working somewhere in the world. And I did look at a lot of the worldwide systems. I became particularly interested in the Vienna model. So when I left Los Angeles, I started working with a group called Global Policy Leadership Academy that has been taking delegations of housing leaders of all types, everything from many state officials, local electeds, policymakers, advocates, activists, everything, bankers, all the folks that are sort of the ecosystem of housing to Vienna, and we've been introducing them to the Vienna model. And I've gotten to know most of the housing people, my counterparts in Vienna. So I've been looking at it really from just a practical implementation standpoint. How does it work? What do they do? I got back from my last official delegation yesterday, so I'm on Vienna time right now. It's about 7 o'clock. And it was great. And one thing I'll share, two things. One is that when I applied for the job in Portland and I met with Commissioner Carmen Rubio, I said what I just told you about my history of working in the government, but also this sense of urgency to explore new ideas. And I said, would you be open to this? And she said, yes, absolutely. We're very interested. So I came here for this conversation. And the second thing I wanted to say is that when we've taken people to Vienna, it hits people in different ways. People have different experiences of it. It's an extraordinarily functional place for housing. People can really afford to live there. But I know that when young people, particularly people who are, say, 40 and under, go there, they really have a strong reaction to both a deep sense of sadness and a sense of anger. Why can't I have this? And so I'm learning to hold space for that, to really understand that there is a model, but that we're in a very different place here. And so, it's a road to get there. So I just wanted to acknowledge that sense of sadness, honestly, that we don't have it. The picture you see here is a place called Zonvenviertel. It was built, it's on a transit-oriented development, transit-oriented district. It's a 17-acre park. It has 5,000 units of housing, half of which are social housing. Let's go on. Next slide.
Okay.
Is it working?
Of course, it's frozen. All right, this is what happens at these things.
Okay, so let me see if I can say anything of value here. So, we can house the people too. That's awesome. So Zonvenviertel.
There we go.
Oh, okay, so a little bit on the history in Vienna. One of the things that I find very compelling. So in 1918, Vienna had between 30 and 60,000 unsheltered people living on their street. The reasons for that are somewhat complicated, but basically, after World War I, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, so Austria was actually the seat of a very large empire. That whole empire was sort of torn apart into smaller pieces, and Austria became a very small country with this giant city of Vienna. And many, many people were immigrating into Vienna. It had not been bombed during World War I, and there was a lot of famine and war in the countryside, and so people were fleeing as refugees into Vienna. So there was a rapid shift in their population, and there was insufficient housing. There was a very, very big distance between wealth and poverty, and many, many people are in poverty. Of course, there was a monarchy that had just failed. And anyway, a lot of people were living in makeshift shelters and doing subsistence farming on the street. Those folks, they were called wild settlers, organized themselves into a self-help movement to try to house themselves and pushed the government of Vienna to create social housing, to start a housing movement. I will also add that at that moment in time, it was the first time women could vote, and they elected a socialist government in Vienna. So Vienna, it was in a more conservative country, but the government of Vienna, and Vienna was operating as currently a city and a state. And the fact that it's a state is important because that enabled it to create a tax. They created a tax, they started to build social housing. Fast forward to today, in 2023, Vienna has been ranked the most livable city in the world multiple times in the last 15 years. It is a highly livable place, and they've continued to do social housing from 1918 all the way through to now, with the exception of 1934 to 1945, during which they had the Nazi Anschluss, which is basically Austria agreed to join up with Germany. Nazis came in, the Nazi government, Austro-fascists came in and stopped social housing. So after World War II happened, Vienna was heavily bombed, and after World War II ended, Russia and the US left, and socialist government was put back in place. They started social housing again. So there was this period of time during which there wasn't social housing, but other than that, it's been pretty consistent all the way through. So there are many types of social housing. People often ask, what is social housing? And I think I put what we call the definition of social housing on the bottom. Social housing models strive to achieve permanent affordability, social equality, and democratic resident control. The two most common types of social housing in Vienna are municipal housing. There's 220,000 units of municipal housing in Vienna, so you think of that as public housing. They're very proud of it. They place the name social housing, or paid for by the housing tax, right on the property, and it's in every community, so it's widely distributed throughout every community. The second type is called limited profit housing. That's privately owned housing, that is non-market housing. They started in the 1980s. It's a financial model that I think is very, very replicable here. I'm very interested in exploring that. Smart apartments are sort of micro units that are typically within the limited profit model. There are owner cooperatives, so standalone owner cooperatives that are not part of either limited profit or municipal housing. There are gentle density. They allow older buildings to add housing units on the top or in the interstitial spaces between units. So they're sort of constantly trying to add housing in between and creating affordability. And then finally, what you'll see on the far right over there is temporary emergency housing. That's actually a cross-laminated timber modular housing that they put into a field to have housing for refugees. It's housing that's supposed to last 30 years but can be moved 3 times. So they created a zoning law that allows housing to be on non-residential land for 10 years. Oh, let's go to the next slide. So one of the most important things to understand is the difference in how markets are structured. So on the far right is how most West Coast cities, San Diego, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Portland, Seattle. Portland's actually a little better off than most of the other cities, but most West Coast cities in the United States have 95% market rate housing and 5% affordable. And in affordable, I mean low-income housing tax credit, public housing, and vouchers. So every form that we have of affordable housing fits into that 5%. That 5% is out of the market, doesn't get impacted by market prices. Everything else does. In Vienna, 56% of the housing is in the market and 44% is outside of the market. So the municipal housing sector, the older municipal housing is 23% of the units. Limited profit housing sector is 21% of the units. And in addition to which, Vienna is much more proactive in housing supply. So their housing supply is usually about twice the size of ours per capita. So they have one housing unit for every 2 people. So they have 3 very active markets, and social housing is both municipal and limited profit. Go to the next slide. So some of the characteristics of social housing in Vienna are that the public sector plays a very active role in land acquisition. Social housing exists in every community in Vienna, and there's no stigma attached to it at all. It's plentiful. It's open to almost everybody. As Camille said, 85% of the population is eligible to be in social housing in Vienna. Wait lists are relatively short. They do have wait lists if you want to get into municipal housing, which is the lowest barrier to entry and generally lower rents than the limited profit sector. The wait list can be up to a year, but on the limited profit side, it's generally shorter. And they're constantly building new. So they're generally speaking, they're doing about 15,000 units a year in a city of 2 million. They have what are called open-ended leases. This is actually historically, for the last 100 years, they've had something called open-ended leases, which are basically leases that are not month to month. They're permanent leases with no end. So there is no end date to your lease. And that is, it really gives people permanent tenure. You can also pass your lease on to your children. So if you have a low-income unit, you can. It feels, even though it's rental, it has a lot of the qualities of ownership. They check incomes on entry into social housing at once and never again. Actually, I just learned this time that on some of the more competitive units, they will check incomes every 5 years, compared to the American system where we check every year. We constantly check to make sure you're still poor. Whereas in Vienna, I think their concept is that, the idea is that your income can go up and should go up, and that's okay that your rent is low. Wealth creation is perceived as low rent while you gain income. They're very focused on anti-displacement measures in terms of how they do rent control and how they prevent displacement within communities. They have democratic resident control. Many of the LPHA units, not all of them, but many of them have an ownership option, so you can buy as an owner into the units. And they really focus on decarbonization that's their current primary focus. And when when you've actually kind of solved the affordability problem, you can think a lot more about environmental concerns. Let's go to the next slide. This is how their income, how they pay for social housing. It's a 1% income tax paid by the employer and the employee, half by each. That generates about 250 million euros. It's almost a 1-to-1 ratio. It's like almost $250 million. And then they also have so many ground leases that they generate about $200 million a year in ground lease. So they have $450 million per year without recurring revenue, without end, coming into the city for new housing. 85% of it goes into capital or new construction, and about 15% go into tenant rent, like rent support. They're very focused on investing in new housing construction. They allocate a portion, 2/3 of it to new construction and about 1/3 to rehabilitation. Next, thank you. So we'll play that in just a sec. So just, lastly on the ecosystem, they have a permanent source of funding, which is fundamental to their ability to continue the policies moving forward. Again, they have a very proactive land strategy. They're the largest land buyer in Vienna. They buy and hold and clear entitled sites, so they take a lot of risk out for the developer. They include the middle class in the social housing. They zone for social housing, so they now have a new zoning law that was enacted in 2019 where any land in Vienna that's not currently zoned residential, if it becomes residentially zoned, it must be 2/3 used for social housing. So they really actively guarantee there will be land available for social housing. They have a very large municipal sector, which is, as Camille said, this is a unique thing to Vienna that they maintained so much municipal housing. They have a very large limited profit sector, which is the nonprofit housing sector. And then they have a public sector that works really in alignment. All of their departments work together, and it's really quite extraordinary to see. As somebody who's worked in government that has tended to be siloed, I'm very jealous of how incredibly well their departments all work together. And then lastly, Tanua Thrash is a colleague and a friend from Los Angeles who went on one of our trips, and if there's a chance, if we can play that. You just hear her take. Oops.
Oh no. I'm sorry, the sound?
I don't know.
I'm sorry.
I can tell you what she says.
Yeah, I apologize. The tech guy disappeared. And
Okay,
so
well, she's just a really awesome person, a leader in Los Angeles on housing. And when she came back, what she's saying is really the last bullet here. I took it from her. She was very impressed that they put people first in Vienna. They start with the person. They start with the human. And then they have this system of departments that all work together to support people, to support the needs of people. And this is really palpable. It's really a beautiful system in that sense. And when I heard her say that, I thought, yeah, that's exactly right. So thanks. That's it.
Thank you. Thank you for that. So now, after hearing about this international model, Ken is going to dive into Montgomery County's model here in our nation, across all the land.
Thanks, Molly, and thank you, Camille and Helmi. I think that's a really great introduction. I think one of the things you'll hear in my presentation is that we don't call our model social housing. I think you can decide for yourselves whether it meets that definition or not. But as you heard, I think there's a lot of different ways to look at what is social housing or what isn't. So as I said, I work for the Housing Opportunities Commission here in Montgomery County, Maryland. Before I joined HOC about 2 years ago, I worked for 10 years at our county council on housing and zoning issues. Just a little preamble, in Montgomery County, we've been sort of battling housing affordability for a long time. Very, very expensive place to live. We have, like I think Helmi's experience, we have a really robust nonprofit development sector where we're maximizing our low-income housing tax credits and other resources. We've done multiple zoning rounds. We were the first jurisdiction in the country to adopt inclusionary zoning in the 70s. And so we had tried all these things to try to address this problem. And certainly, I think it's better than if we hadn't done all those things. But we still had a big problem. Ultimately, there is no one solution, but that's what kind of led us to look at a new model. If you go to the next slide.
Oh, goodness.
So when it comes in, next slide is just a little bit of context about the county. So for anybody that doesn't know, we're a suburb of Washington, D.C. It's a very big county. We have about 1 million people. County government is the major service provider for most of the county, not a lot of incorporated cities. A very, very diverse county. So we have some very wealthy areas. We have some deep poverty and areas with a lot of need. And we are a majority people of color. There we go. So there's some facts about how we're diverse on all different dimensions. And you can see our median home value is almost $600,000. That includes condos, townhouses. Single-family home value is just shy of $1 million. And our average one-bedroom rent is about $2,000 a month. If you can go to the next slide. So this is a little bit of background about HOC. So HOC is a little bit unique as a housing authority. We started as a traditional housing authority in 1966, where we basically bought buildings and operated them as public housing. In 1974, same time that we created inclusionary zoning, our county leaders, as the federal government was really stepping back from public housing, felt like we needed to find a way to take matters more into our own hands. And they transformed what was the Housing Authority of Montgomery County into the Housing Opportunities Commission with a broader set of powers and a broader mission. And so we're celebrating our 50th anniversary as HOC this year. And the main broadening of authority was the ability to issue bonds and write mortgages as a local housing finance agency. And so we started to do that to provide more affordable mortgages for single-family homes, and we started to finance nonprofit and other private developments in the county. And then in 1989, we developed our first non-public housing multifamily mixed-income property called Timberlawn. That was done all with debt and some state grants. Still operating today. It's in a really nice part of the county, beautiful property. And over the next 3 decades or so, we've managed to accumulate a pretty large portfolio. This is just some context about the people that we serve. So you can see we have a pretty high area median income, and we're serving primarily people in the 30 to 50% AMI range. Those are averages, so it does mask. We have a range of different affordability levels in different programs. And if you look at the multifamily income, so that's the folks that are in these locally funded mixed income properties. So right around between 30 and 40% AMI on average. And then you can see we're serving 80+% people of color across our customer base. Next slide, please. So that's sort of the background. In 2021, we had been learning a little bit about Vienna social housing, about some of the other models, and we had a council member, a couple of council members that were really interested and supportive and wanted to find ways to do more, and came to HOC to basically, say, hey, this is great that you're able to do these mixed income developments, but how can you do, a lot more? How can we scale this up to really meet the need? And so what we came up with was what we call the Housing Production Fund. I was sort of joking earlier, at the time, I don't think we knew that it would sort of blow up the way that it has. We were just excited to get to move a bunch of projects forward. But we've gotten a lot of attention, and I'm very happy to see a number of places across the country starting to move forward with different versions of this model. And I think I'm going to go through how we do it, but one of the things I always want to stress is one of the beauties of this is that it's a local model, and so every jurisdiction can do it differently based on the way that their institutions work and their values. If you can go to the next slide, please. So this is just sort of shows how the money flows. So starting on the left there, started with our council adopting an annual appropriation to be able to fund the principal and interest on $100 million of bonds. We actually did this in two $50 million tranches in 2021 and 2022, but just to kind of simplify at least a little bit. If you follow the sort of thicker blue arrow there, that annual appropriation goes to HOC, and that allows us to issue the bonds. And with the backing of a AAA rated county, we get about as good of an interest rate as you can get on municipal debt. Then that money is created the Housing Production Fund, which is controlled by our commission. So following the arrows around there, we put staff develops projects, and those can generally come either from land that we own or other government-owned land that we're able to get control of, in which case we'll do an RFP and select a development consultant, development partner to help us to build the building. Or we can buy into existing private developments. And so the picture you saw on the earlier slide of the Laureate, which is the first building that we built with this fund, was a private development that was fully entitled, basically shovel ready. The developer was stalled on their financing, and so we basically bought the project. And now we're the majority owner, and we were able to build the building in under 2 years and get it open. Once the building is built and leased up, then we use our HFA authority to do a permanent mortgage, refinance the building, and that allows us to repay the Housing Production Fund so that that funding is available for another project. Another thing I want to highlight is if you follow the sort of skinnier arrow back, we charge 5% interest. So the projects pay 5% interest on those HPF loans, and that money goes back to the county. So 5% on 100 million, it's $5 million a year. So that reduces the county's fiscal outlay to $2.7 million a year, each year for 20 years. After 20 years, that whole left side of the slide will fall away, and that $100 million fund will keep on, be available to keep revolving forever with no additional cost. The other thing I want to highlight on this slide is that there is a policy choice here. So on the right-hand side, you see our minimum affordability, which is 70% or 30% affordable, 70% market. We do consider that to be a floor, and so on every project, we look at different ways to try to push that up, and we can do that sometimes just based on the market rents. If they're good enough, we're able to squeeze a little bit more out, or by layering in, other tools, whether that's vouchers or tax credits or local housing trust fund loans or grants to be able to do more. But there's a trade-off there between that and the interest that we paid back. So if our county wanted to pay the full $7.7 million a year, we could probably provide more affordability or potentially do 30% units. And on the flip side, if our county wanted to have zero fiscal impact, we could reduce the affordability on those projects. And how exactly that calculation works obviously would depend on your market environment. So if you can go to the next slide. So this slide is really, another view at the same model. So, what you can see is here, what we really tried to do was design a third channel. So we have, as I said, a really robust, nonprofit development community. We do a lot of tax credit development. We didn't want to cannibalize those funds. We want to keep doing as much of that as we can. We also want to keep having as much private development as we can get in the county. But we wanted to have the opportunity to do more. The other thing I would highlight here is that you can see that the Housing Production Fund model is actually much more similar to the private development model than it is to the typical affordable housing development, where you might have 10 or more sources of different funding sources, which is really complex. The timing is difficult, managing all of that. And that was actually a key advantage of this fund, is the speed that we're able to move, and a lot of that is the simplicity of just having this, the most expensive, capital that you're going to need for your development is that sort of private equity at the bottom of the stack. And so having that available and under our control, and knowing that it's going to be there really makes it a lot easier. The other thing is that, at least in our state, because of the demand for the federal subsidy, you really don't see tax credit developments that are more than 120 or 130 units. It's just you just can't get enough resources to be able to do more than that. And so even though the percentages are different, you have 100% affordable development on the right side. Our building is 30% affordable. Because our projects can be so much bigger, you're getting actually the same number of affordable units. So these are obviously all made up, but about 400 units is the size of our average HPF development. We can go to the. So this is a snapshot of our pipeline. And so you can see we've finished one project, the Laureate. We're now, it actually is now, I think, 99% leased. It got stabilized in record time, much faster than we expected, actually. So that was definitely an unknown. Would there be any question about demand for these projects? and these are delivered as public-private partnerships. So HOC is the majority owner. We own and control the properties, and that allows us to make the affordability permanent. But they are developed and managed by private development companies. And so if I was able to take you on a tour of the Laureate, it's really indistinguishable from any other transit-oriented mid-rise building that you'd see around any transit station in any major city. It has all of the typical luxury amenities, a dog wash station and a kids play area. And it's really a beautiful building, and there's absolutely no difference between the affordable units and the market units. And actually, I think most people who live there, if you're in the market units, you probably don't know that you live in a social housing building. You just think you pay the rent to a big private landlord. And so that could be a feature or a bug, I guess, depending on who you ask. But so you can see our next building is under construction there. The other thing I would highlight is, right around 2027, 2028, we hope to have sort of the first phase of buildings paying back in. And then you can see how we have the available to then revolve into, the next set of projects. And so as we move forward, the ability to really start to plan 10, 15, 20 years ahead based on knowing when these projects are going to revolve is opening up all kinds of opportunities. We've also been highlighting for our county and state and anyone else that if we had more money, we could do more. And so we could potentially pull forward some of those projects that are in the next phase. And so we've started to raise that a little bit. And if you go to the next slide, I am really excited that we, after trying for a couple years, we were successful with getting, we have some great partners in the state legislature that just about a month ago, our state legislative session adjourned, and they did adopt for the first time what they're calling a housing innovation fund. The legislation is pretty open, so a lot is going to depend on exactly how it's implemented. But we have a really great partner in our Governor Moore and our a great housing secretary. And so, this is another source of funding for us, as well as, we're talking with other jurisdictions in Maryland about trying to stand these things up. So I think that's actually my last slide. We do have some more information on our website. And I'm very happy to answer any questions. I'm very glad to be here. Thanks, Molly.
Great. Thanks, Ken. And so finally, we structured it so we're going to bring it home with our neighbor, Kaileah from Seattle, who, like she stated, is the chair of the board of their new social housing agency. So take it away, Kaileah.
Yeah, so pardon me, I don't have any slides. We have been a board for just under a year. We're formed, had our first board meeting in May of last year. Our board is made up of 13 seats, and those seats have been established by the charter that the House Our Neighbors Coalition developed in that research period and policy writing period that Camille had mentioned earlier. So that was all developed ahead of the, running of the ballot initiative and the passing of it in February of 2023. Our board is as guided by the charter that was passed along with Initiative 135. Our board consists of 7 seats that are renter seats. Right now, those are just any renter in and around Seattle or established or selected by the Seattle Renters Commission. In future, once the Seattle social housing developer has buildings, those seats will be filled by people who live in the developments. So it's intended for this board of 13 to be half governed by folks who have direct experience and are directly impacted by the social housing developer. It's intended as a community stewardship of land type of model, where the folks who are in the buildings have say over their living experience. The other seats are filled with a variety of labor representatives, community representatives, and particular skill set folks. So an urban planner, a housing specialist, and housing finance person. And someone who has experience with a specialization in passive house, which is a requirement in the charter for any new developments to be built with passive house for better utility, like green energy utilization and sustainability. So I am one of the renters. I am born and raised in Seattle. I'm nearly a lifelong renter. Have lived in basements with my mother and my sister, and so know the struggles of housing insecurity in Seattle, and how it has so little to do with whether, like, how hard you're working or what you're doing, right? I come from teachers. I'm third generation educator. I don't educate right now, but I have a degree in education. And that's one of the things of Seattle right now is that the crisis of housing instability is not faced by only our lowest income people. It is faced by so many of our people across income levels. It includes our teachers. It includes our restaurant service industry workers. It includes our folks who are our technology bros who then get fired and then are SOL for a year or whatever. And that having stable housing is so important for healthy communities, for communities that are able to grow and that are communities that are able to care for one another. So that solidarity mindset is one of the core values of the Seattle social housing developer, is really wanting to grow and bloom our need for cross-class solidarity throughout our city, so that we know and recognize how close folks who are living how our homelessness crisis is a crisis of the instability and insecurity of housing, including how easy it is to lose your home even when you have a job, even when you have a job and then you break up with your partner and then you can't afford your rent anymore. So those are some of the goals of trying to add this Seattle social housing developer, this social housing model, for a greater range of incomes, of greater range of people who can access highly stable housing for our city. Right now, we're just in the stage of figuring out how to be a governing body and standing up things with very few resources. The I-135 initiative, because of Washington state laws, it had to be separated from any conversation of funding the developer. And so the I-135, which was passed last year, only established the developer. It did also include a stipulation that the city has to cover operational costs for 18 months. That'll run us through. That started at the beginning of this year, so it'll run us through middle of 2025. Operational costs being us being able to be together, be paying for materials to have at our board meetings, as well as developing our website, as well as developing governance structures, paying for lawyers, and getting our CEO search underway, which has happened. We are in process of hiring a CEO. We'll be having interviews later this month. Paying for that CEO's salary for that period, and other startup staff that we will hopefully be able to hire by the end of this year. What we're facing now is working on establishing our governance models, establishing a plan of how, steps 1, steps 2, steps 3, and just getting all of our board members up to speed on what is needed for establishing and creating a development model and an entity that is able to pursue funding, allocate that funding responsibly, and in ways that align with our charter. The charter itself has a bunch of musts, and then it has various shoulds. And so really trying to get going on starting things up in ways that match all the musts and that try to address as many of the shoulds as we can, and then having plans for addressing the rest of the shoulds as we get going. We're still very new. We only got our first bit of funding that was secured to us by the state and the city at the beginning of this month. That has been a bit of the chicken and the egg situation of we have a bunch of things that we need to do to stand ourselves up to be a reputable agency. The various governments are how can we know that you're a reputable agency? And I'm yeah, because we need money to be able to pay professionals to be able to help us stand things up. So that has been definitely a struggle. And I would say that it's also been a struggle to with not very set guidance on which steps are needed. Kaileah, you need to stand up this tax, structure in this way. No one was telling me which what check box I need to check in order to file. So the newness of it is pretty strange and odd, but we're really excited about trying stuff, about going through those processes and then being able to share what we learn with other crews, because we know that there are so many other people across the country who are pursuing or interested in doing social housing in their areas, and so we want to be able to share our story and that sort of things. But again, it's which parts do we do first? We got to be able to be an entity, gotta hire a person, gotta get a space, gotta get insurance. It's a lot of kind of boring stuff that is not yet housing. And yes, I think that has been our crew cares so deeply about our city and about addressing this problem that we have of high houselessness, of high housing insecurity, of high housing turnover, just people having to switch where they live every year, and that how jarring that is for our people. And so we're all very energized about this thing, very passionate about it, which can also be, what's the word I want? The intensity can sometimes get in our way. But we're moving things. I don't know what else to say about how we're doing.
Thank you all so much. So if you have questions out there, write them down, or just raise your hand, and we'll bring you a mic. But we have one from the audience that I'm going to ask the panelists. We have about 25 more minutes, and then you all get to get up and stretch and have a break before the next awesome panel. So somebody asked, are the 30% units permanently affordable? Does somebody want to jump in?
For Montgomery County? Yeah.
Any and all of the
Certainly,
models?
In our model, yes. So I think that's a key differentiator is because we own these properties, we don't intend to ever sell them or do anything else with them. They are permanently affordable. Yes.
Any of the other models? Are the other models permanent as well?
All of the social housing in Vienna is permanently affordable.
Thank you.
Same as Seattle. Just for what it's worth, the charter states that the developer cannot sell off properties and that all units have to remain permanently affordable to their tenants.
Thanks, y'all. So then they had a second part of the question. Can you speak a little bit more to the difference in the Maryland model and the Seattle model? How are they different?
I think that one of the ways is that our charter states clearly that the Seattle social housing developer has to be the manager and has to maintain and develop and be sole owner of the developments. It sounds like Montgomery County has this opportunity to partner with developers, and so is able to own those properties, continue to put money into creating or acquiring additional properties without the burden is probably not the right word, but without that responsibility.
Yeah, I'm not 100% familiar with exactly.
And we're still figuring the things out.
I think that is one of the big, at least between Montgomery County and Vienna or some of the other social housing models or proposals, is that from the tenant point of view, it's still a more traditional American, landlord-tenant relationship. We do have the public ownership, and so we have contract third-party managers, but we have the ability to end those contracts or switch managers. And we do have there are some benefits of living in these publicly owned buildings. For example, so we just adopted a rent stabilization law in Montgomery County, but even before that, HOC has had a long-standing policy of abiding by our county's voluntary rent guidelines, basically inflation, and that applies to the market units as well as the affordable units. And we're also just, in COVID, we were the first to have an eviction moratorium. We were by far the last to eliminate it. We have all these other, as part of a public housing authority, we have some other resources that we're able to help folks. So if people start to have difficulty, we're able to, not every time, but as much as we can, work with some of our other programs or other partner agencies in a way that a private landlord might not.
Yeah, I think too that so go ahead, Camille. I was just going to talk about how we're because our board requires for half of it to be renters or folks in the developments. It's the governance model is I think unique from the Montgomery County model.
I think that the biggest difference from a more technical policy standpoint, and we couldn't go back and do it this way just because of the political nature in the city of Seattle, but HOC is a public housing authority. It was already a structure. All of these growing pains that Kaileah and the board are going through would probably not be as dramatic if we had been able to just use the Seattle Housing Authority and gone that way. But the government in the city of Seattle, the Seattle Housing Authority, expressed very early on that they had absolutely no interest in pursuing this. And so if people in Portland are interested in doing this and the ability to have government officials and public housing authority people with interest in doing it, go that way. It would save a lot of headache.
Thank you all. So we have another question from the audience. how, if at all, does the social housing model incorporate supportive housing, which is housing for folks who need social services to access and remain in housing?
I can start on this one because I do come from the majority of the work that I've done prior to doing research in social housing was in homelessness, and so I do know the drastic need for supportive housing and permanent supportive housing. I think, so the Seattle Social Housing Developer was established not with the intent of being supportive housing. It is affordable housing for people who don't need supports, for people who literally just need somewhere that they can afford. But what we did learn through the process of campaigning is the affordable housing developers that were the most supportive of our initiative were the permanent supportive housing developers, because we have an organization specifically in Seattle called Solid Ground, who is one of our largest permanent supportive housing providers in the city. And what they have found, and what I have found in my experience working in homelessness as well, is permanent supportive housing can be permanent for those who need it to be permanent. But there's a lot of people who, after becoming stable over however many years, they no longer need those permanent supports. But then there becomes this backlog of people who need the permanent supportive housing and people who live in the permanent supportive housing who don't need those supports anymore. And our vision is that social housing can provide that affordability, that guarantee of permanent affordability to people who no longer need PSH, and can then be sort of funneled into social housing to open up those units for people who are on these long wait lists for PSH.
Thanks, Camille. Anybody else want to jump in? And then we got two more questions.
I'll just add, I think we really think of this as a platform, and then it enables us to, so we do have actually, I think, 2 units in the Laureate, which is our first building that we highlighted, that are not units, but we have permanent supportive housing residents that are funded through separate program, in that building. So certainly having, housing that you're not going to face, discrimination from the landlord, and you're able to layer those on. I also didn't talk about design, so we've done a lot of work on universal design and accessibility in these buildings. We have done a lot of work on sustainability, and so actually the property that's under construction now is going to be the first. Sorry, it's kind of a mouthful. Net zero energy passive house multifamily building in the Mid-Atlantic region. So trying to sort of push that forward, at least for our county. So again, I think it's really having that public control allows you to make those value judgments and layer on whatever priorities are most important for your community.
Thank you for that. We're going to move on. The questions are rolling in. So maybe just one of you could take this one. How is land acquisition funded, and where do the dollars come from?
Well, I can talk about it in Vienna. The land acquisition is funded through the 1% income tax. It goes to an organization whose primary role is as a land bank. It's called Woonfonds Wien, and Woonfonds Wien acquires land. Conceptually, this is not technically accurate, but they conceptually look forward at the housing demands for the next 15 years and ensure there's enough land acquired by the public agency under city ownership to build that amount of land. They very actively convert brownfields to new housing developments, and there are 3 or 4 projects that we visit on our trip. 3 projects for sure that have that are on like former rail yards. One is on a former airport, former airfield, that have between like 5,000 to 10,000 units of new housing constructions. They're very actively doing it. Plus, they layer in lots of open space and public transportation. That's what they start with, is the transportation network, and then they build the housing around it.
Thanks for that. Someone asked, can you help us understand the bridge between homelessness and these models of housing?
I want to talk. the pie chart that I shared with you, well, Vienna has a functional zero houselessness. They have a system where if you see someone who is houseless on the street, you can dial a number and social workers will show up and help that person into either shelter, or they do have a housing first policy. And most people that are coming out of houselessness into the shelter system actually get housing within the regular social housing. They're not like in separate permanent supportive housing developments. They're generally right in the system. And there's a very robust social service network that enables people that need additional support, whether it's through mental health care or physical health care, to support them. So it's very much integrated into the policy of of housing. But I started off with the pie chart, and the thing I wanted to mention about the pie chart is just the percentage of housing that is out of the market in Vienna is over 40%, and that has two really important functions. One is it creates a huge supply of housing that's affordable. More than 50% of the people of Vienna live in it, live in that 40% of housing. Plus, it also pushes down on the market rents. So the market rents are actually quite affordable as well, because there's options, there's housing options for people. So most people have access to some housing they can afford in Vienna.
I would also say that, as Ken mentioned too, and that this is the feeling in the Seattle social housing developer, we are not aiming to usurp the role of housing services and organizations who do homelessness support and support folks who are currently living outside. These models are meant to prevent folks from becoming homeless. Evictions by legal evictions or by economic evictions are how people become unhoused, and that is what we are trying to avoid by building up the supply of more affordable, socially controlled housing for across levels of income. I used to work at a nonprofit that was a housing provider for low-income housing, and that ceiling that folks get to when they no longer qualify for that housing is a big reason why people end up either becoming homeless, right? That happens, or becoming really stagnant in their job or whatever, and so that is one of the goals of these models, is to allow for folks to be able to continue to grow their wealth without risk of losing affordability of their home.
Thank you for that. Okay, so we've got 10 minutes left, and as you can see, I have a big pile of questions because y'all are so interesting. So maybe if just one person takes each question from here on out. Are there clinical admission criteria for social housing, or is it all about income qualifications? And then follow-up, can someone who is staying on the streets actively be housed directly in social housing? You kind of answered that, Helmi.
I will just share with you, in Vienna, the income qualifications are almost 200% of the median. So if you earn double than average, you're income qualified for all social housing. They allocate the municipal housing based on need. So for example, they have a specific, if you are recently divorced and you need to find housing, especially if you have children, they tend to focus on that, they will find, you can go towards the top of the list. If you have suffered some kind of an illness, you can go to the top of the list. So their actually allocation criteria is not based on income so much as it's based on housing need, and most people are income qualified. So it is actually a very interesting, different way of allocating housing than we do here in the U.S.
Thank you for that. Next one. How does this model look different at different scales? City, county, state, federal? What are the challenges of extending past city limits? And then, just to follow up while I'm at it, what does developer fees look like compared to a typical LIHTC project on a social housing project?
Do you want me to take some of these? Okay, I'm going to talk about the government one. I learned so I've been in government in the United States for a long time, and I learned
this saying when I first joined government that I only really understood like 20 years later. But it's federal money has chains attached, state money has ropes attached, and local money has strings attached. So, so one of the challenges of innovation with federal dollars is that you're jumping through all kinds of hoops. You're constantly audited in ways that you are not necessarily, you have more flexibility generally locally. And that's just because as governments get bigger, there's more participation of different points of view in it, and it just, whatever. I don't really know why, but I'm actually fascinated that the Housing Authority was able to do this, because that's a federal context in which you're working. And that is creates some challenges that you don't have when you're working with local dollars. So I do think my own point of view is that experimentation happens best at the local level, that you can actually sort of workshop and work through how to do things locally. And once you start to prove up models that work, you can start to expand them to bigger and bigger locate areas. So that's why I'm really excited to see what's happening in Seattle, really excited to see what's happening in Montgomery County, because those are models we can start looking at and seeing, do they resonate locally, do they work? The other question on the developer fee, well, I'm only going to explain within the context of, so LIHTC has a developer fee. Developer fees are perfectly fine. The thing that you kind of have to have them in order for the system to continue functioning. What is really constrained in the Vienna limited profit model is the profit taking over time. So in the case of the limited profit model, which is a privately owned model in Vienna, the rents are based on the cost of construction. There's caps to prevent it from being too high, but the owners of it can only take 3.5% return on their invested capital to themselves. The owners are generally nonprofit cooperatives, so they can take 3.5% return, and the rest of it is rest of the cash flow that may come over time goes in. They're actually required to put it into a revolving fund and then reinvest it into future housing. And they actually are obligated to continue investing in housing. So I think there's a lot of similarities. It sounds similar to what Montgomery County is doing, is this idea of a revolving fund. But the developer fee is, I don't know what the developer fee exactly is in Vienna. It's actually something I'm looking into. But they do take a developer fee at the time, because they're not really taking any profits ever into the future other than 3.5% return.
Yeah, I would want to say also the Seattle social housing developer, we again are quite new and have had to focus our time on standing up as an agency. So we haven't been able to really thoroughly develop a model or really thoroughly address these questions of like, okay, are we letting who are we targeting with our housing, that sort of thing, because we don't yet have housing. What our charter does state is, among those shoulds, has a lot of specific guidelines around evictions should be avoided almost at all costs, and that housing should be available to folks at 0% AMI. Housing should be available to folks of all income levels. What we are interested in, or what we have a latent interest in, is being able to pursue funding that doesn't come with those chains. But that will be really difficult. But that is part of the goal of being an additional tool and not trying to usurp funding sources that other needed housing providers are utilizing to provide housing. But again, trying to add something that is different, trying to create additional diversity in the housing landscape so that there is space for folks to be able to access housing who might get rejected by other housing spaces, or who in various ways, earn too much money, haven't quit alcohol yet. Those sorts of things are, we're still having to figure out what those things would be, but it is not of interest to us to be all these extra rules. We want people to be able to afford their housing.
Definitely. Okay, I'm going to try to get a couple more questions in. We're probably not going to get to all of them, unfortunately, but we will follow up with these lovely folks. So how do you ensure that properties, management, and ownership stay local? And then they give a very specific local example. Central City Concerns building, Cedar Commons, sits in East Portland, but the land is owned by a San Francisco LLC that is funded by a Milwaukee, Wisconsin trust fund. So a, quote, public PSH resource is essentially funneling local dollars out of our state.
Yeah, I think that's, in some ways I think of the Housing Production Fund as replacing the private equity that finances most private development at the bottom. And so that's why, we had that slide that showed the buildings. So, in a private development, you're going to have, a bank construction loan for 50 or 60 or 65%. And then you have private equity where you're paying, potentially 20% return. In this market, you may not be able to get it at all. And, so we wanted to be able to fund things locally and keep that money in our own jurisdiction. And so we're using our municipal finance ability to replace that part of the stack and maintain that ownership. I think it goes maybe a little bit to the developer fee question as well, where we do have these public-private partnerships, but we're really paying the developer as a service provider, but they're not. We're capturing the long-term upside. So if the land appreciates over 20 years, the public captures that income. And I think sort of the next step that we're starting to look at now is, over the long term. Again, we've only built one building, so we're not like, swimming in money yet. But if we are successful in doing this over the long term, and there is revenue that is produced out of this, can we create a mechanism that would return it to people? And so we're looking at maybe a rental assistance model, or a guaranteed income model, or just a cash transfer model, for how we could, make sure that, if we don't squeeze that extra 5% of affordability out at the front end, that we're able to, use that to make sure that, it goes back to the people in our community.
And at the Seattle level, that those pieces were written into the legislation that was passed with I-135, that properties will that are purchased by the Seattle social housing developer stay with the Seattle social housing developer permanently.
Thank you for that. Okay, I'm going to do one last one, and these other ones, we'll get some written feedback. Welcome Home will send out an email. Maybe you'll read it and find your question answered. I hope you all do. So much to learn, and we just don't have enough time. So this question says, both the Vienna and Singapore model utilize very long-term leasing. Compared to the American model, this can sound utopian. Can you identify tangible steps that can make these types of leases a possibility here in the U.S.? So I'd say, Camille, your research, Helmi, your Vienna knowledge.
I think in Singapore, what they've done, it's still sort of an experiment because they have these 99-year leases, but Singapore is not yet 99 years old. And so it's sort of, when I was there last year, we were talking about this, and there's still a lot of question of what that actually is going to mean once residents hit their 99 years. It is largely speculated that people will be able to just renew those 99-year leaseholds in perpetuity. But I think that in terms of steps, I'm pretty optimistic as a person when it comes to this particular type of housing, because I can look at a model that looks on the outside extraordinarily different from ours. And yes, Singapore's governance as a country is extremely different from what we do here. Having a single party system has benefited them in some ways of being able to really control so much of the land. But there are simple policy decisions that we can make, and I think that the Seattle social housing developer, as an example, is, there are not lease terms or lease limits on the units as defined in the charter for the Seattle social housing developer. They are permanent. They are, once a person is in, they are in. It doesn't matter if their income rate, increases. It doesn't matter if, they have changing jobs and all of these different things. They're in. And so I think that we can write policies in ways that ensure these because leases are such a construct, and I don't know. I think that ensuring permanence is a policy decision that any local, county, state government can make, and federal as well. I mean, it's a long shot in this country, but we can try.
So one of the things I've been very impressed with Portland is that you already have 99-year covenants on your affordable housing. I've never seen a jurisdiction do that. So I came here blown away by the length of the affordability restrictions that are already part of the city policy. In terms of ground leases, 99-year ground leases is very common in the United States on public land. So if public land is set aside for affordable housing, it's pretty typically done at a 99-year ground lease, and that, in a legal sense, is what's considered permanent in the U.S. is 99 years. So I think the policy here already exists. The question would be on assembling land that's not currently in public ownership. Can you, for example, if there's a community land trust, which I do think are excellent models for doing a social housing type program, are the community land trusts setting their affordability restrictions for 99 years? Are they on 99-year ground leases or even perpetuity ground leases? Vienna does, I believe, perpetuity ground leases, not 99 years. They've already exceeded 99 years of this social housing, so they just keep going. But I agree. I think once you get to 99, you're pretty much permanent. So I really think it's actually quite doable here in the U.S.
Thank you so much for that. And with that, I'm just going to say to the policymakers in the room, it sounds like we need to get a higher percentage of our housing stock out of the private market and into our public sector. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for being here and continuing to chat. This is really exciting to see this many folks hear about housing and wanting to solve problems around housing. It's great to see you all here. So this section we're going to jump into is, it's called Housing First, not Housing Only. If you've been listening to the news, you might think Housing First is housing only. So we want to talk about what it actually is here today. A lot of this has to do with the difference between a home and a house, right? Housing is the physical structure in which people live. A home is something that lives in your heart and your spirit and your soul. So when we say housing first and we say it's housing first, not housing only, it's yes, the structure, but that's not where the work stops. We are still community. We are still full beings. There's still lots of work to do. But we have to, at least at some point, have that structure happen. Have that physical space where people are safe, where people have rights, where people are comforted, where people can find their peace, where people can then find their home. We have an incredible list of incredible group of experts here for you for this particular panel. Just as we were doing before, really want to encourage folks to submit questions. We've got our little basket over here. Don't be afraid if a question hits you and we're still super early in this panel, come bring it up. You don't have to sit with it. You don't have to wait until the end. I'm going to try to actually pepper questions in as we go so that we have a really nice full discussion. And just to give you a little bit of a sense of who we have here today, we have Margaret Salazar, a longtime local leader in housing. She was formerly the head of the Oregon Housing Community Services and the regional director of HUD, and is now coming to us from REACH CDC, local champion. Thank you so much for being on our panel today, Margaret. We also have Noah Fay, who works at the Downtown Emergency Service Center in Seattle. DESC has done some incredibly impressive work around Housing First, and it has the research to back it up, and we're really looking forward to hearing from Noah today. We have Anna Rausch coming to us all the way from Texas to share her experience and expertise in working to reduce homelessness with the Coalition of Homelessness in Houston, where they are really leading the way on a Housing First approach, and we're really excited to see what is going on with our friends down south. And then we have Tsemberis, who is coming to us from California, and his organization, Pathways Housing First Institute, where he has been building on the theory and practice of Housing First and teaching others how to do this work in their communities. Thank you so much for being here. We were going to start with a little bit of a video, but as you all saw, our video is not happening today, but I deeply encourage you, when you leave here today, have the first thing you do to go home and look up a short video that's called Rain City Housing, where it's going to give you some of the most succinct language you could possibly get around how to explain Housing First to all your friends and family who are like, what is this thing and why are you so passionate about it? But first, we're going to do a little bit of panel discussion. Again, bring up those questions as we go, and then we'll start doing a fuller discussion here with the group. But Sam, we're going to go ahead and start with you. This video was going to be as a production from your organization, but I'm going to pass the mic over to you to talk to us about your organization and the work you're doing.
Thank you. Okay, good morning.
Good morning.
Great to be here. I'm going to keep my talk short because I've just made reservations to go to Vienna, and so that was so inspiring to hear about all of that. But I'll show you these slides first. Housing First, I think my task is to describe what Housing First is, and because there's been a very widespread implementation of the term and a lot of confusion about how to actually implement it properly. So one of the reasons that the term Housing First is used so widely is that when it's done well, it produces great effects. It has a lot of evidence and research behind it, and the federal government at HUD has adopted it as a national policy, not necessarily funded, not necessarily well defined, but has sort of encouraged everyone to be doing Housing First. And that's led to a lot of confusion about how we do this thing. So in the time I have, I'm going to go quickly through a few slides to try and define it and say what it is and what it isn't. Housing First has three main components. One is, of course, a permanent housing component, whether that's a subsidy, all of the social housing that we heard about. Housing First operates in about 20 European countries right now, and social housing is primarily the type of housing that is used for the Housing First programs. One of the, in answer to the question about who qualifies for the social housing, and I thought it was an interesting answer that you gave about, is it just affordability? And it's not just about affordability, you said. It's about, is this somebody who's a widow or divorced and has kids, or someone with a psychiatric disability, which is using this thing that we're harnessed with, this coordinated entry system, and an attempt to prioritize only on the issue of chronicity, not taking into account, for example, all of these subtle things about people's lives, the acuity of their condition or their need. So Housing First has been primarily focused on people who are long-term homeless, chronic homeless, as identified by HUD, and also have some level of disability, usually psychiatric and substance abuse. So in addition to the first component, which is everybody needs housing, and that housing could be looks different in different places. Most of the time, it's an apartment of one's own. And then the service is a second component, and the service is absolutely attached to the housing. And most of my comments in the next few minutes really relate to the services, because the services is what makes the program successful. And the third component is a philosophy, kind of a program philosophy, where how do you operate your program and why do you operate it this way? And a consumer-directed philosophy talks about empowerment, talks about client choice, talks about a person-directed approach, which I also heard in the first panel, that in Vienna, the housing system is a person-centered approach. Like, you're actually thinking about the type of housing a person needs rather than a placement into housing. It's an interactive process. Is housing first for everyone? Could be. If people qualify in terms of income, they could be. But for the most part in this country, we use it for the sort of 20% of the people who are chronically homeless. And we have other things like rapid rehousing or other short-term housing programs for everyone else. But ideally, if you wanted to end homelessness per se, and we were in a different country and there was enough affordable housing, everybody who's homeless needs housing. So yes, it's housing for everyone. And for people who are housing first, you would need support services for them. So that's really the distinction. So is housing first for everyone? Yes, if we had housing for everyone, of course it would end homelessness. But we don't, and what we do is we focus on the 20% that need both housing and services because they're the most vulnerable, and it's a decision we've made. There are a few different models in the way that we serve people who are homeless in this country, and I would say they basically can be classified into three different models. One is a medical model approach, which I think much of PSH and shelter, all of the treatment first approaches, like kind of sobriety treatment and then housing approaches, or you're living in housing that also has services, I would qualify that as a kind of a medical model approach. There's also charity models, where you have sort of first aid, and you have all of the groups that give out tents or shoes or clothing, kind of helping the poor model. And the third one is the enforcement model, which we've also had a lot of experience with. Right now we're Supreme Court hearing arguments about, can you stay on public land or will you get arrested? And so the enforcement model is also very strong. Translates also into it overlaps with treatment, because involuntary treatment is also becoming quite popular now. California just passed care courts and Proposition 1. So medical, charity, enforcement are the main approaches. For the Housing First program was developed years after that system of care where people had to work their way or earn their way into housing, because there was a group that persistently could not or would not agree to participate in treatment or follow the rules, or could not. And so they remained outside. So we needed a plan B. Housing First was a plan B. And unlike the medical or charity or enforcement models, it's based on the philosophical foundation that housing is a basic human right. It's not something you have to be sick to get or work hard to get or be clean and sober to get. Everyone who doesn't have housing should have housing. The social housing models we heard about are based on a societal agreement that housing is a basic human right. And they've just sort of figured out all of the finances to do that. But underlying that, no one has to earn it. If you don't have the income to qualify, you get it. And it's not uncommon to hear the presentations of countries in Europe saying, before we talk about housing and services, let's talk about the social contract. What do we all believe in, you know? And they'll say, we believe in housing as an education, healthcare are all human rights. We believe that people that make a lot of money should pay a lot of taxes. It's like, really, what planet am I on? You know? But it's here, and it happens. One of the things about Housing First, fundamentally, I would say the fundamental difference from an operational perspective, and you know, this goes back to Galileo, it's not about the program, it's about the person. Fundamentally, I would say Housing First is a shift from trying to change people to fit into programs to operating a program that serves people, so that you have a program that is flexible enough that can accommodate the needs of the person in the sequence they need it, in the intensity they need it, in the duration they need it. And when you start operating that way, what you find out right away, especially when you're working with people who are homeless, is that they want a place to live right away. That's how we got to Housing First. It wasn't that we were going and saying, hey, you're homeless, let's give you a place to live. We say, hey, you're homeless and you're in terrible shape. What is it that I can do for you that would be most useful to you? So that most people say housing. But I want to just get this clear. Housing First is not about putting a person in an apartment right away. It's about helping them with the thing that they need most. Most of the time you're going to get to housing, but if they want recovery, or if they want detox, or if they want, you know, just, I don't know, to rest in a shelter for a while, that's what we would do. It's not prescriptive that way. It's led by the client. So, does Housing First mean that the first thing you do is put a person into an apartment right away? Yes? No. No. What is the first thing you do? Yes. Talk to the person. Housing First is not about housing. Housing First is about a relationship. And it starts with a relationship. And that's a relationship defined by the person. It's most frequently known as getting people into housing right away because that's what people want. Here's another myth about Housing First. Oh, you just put people in housing and you leave them there. This is the Housing First, not housing only piece. A person has to sign a lease and has to meet the terms and conditions of a standard lease. You'll probably hear this from a lot of us. They also have to agree to a home visit. Now, the terms and conditions of a standard lease means the person pays 30% of their income towards the rent and also manages all of the other conditions that we have to meet. You know, you can't have traffic, you can't be dealing out of your apartment, you can't have guests staying for a long time that are not on your lease. Standard lease, standard rules apply. We're not over-enabling people, we're just making the playing field the same for people who are homeless as we have for the rest of us. The only difference is that a home visit is required. But the home visit is required to be made by the staff, not by the client. You've just housed someone who's maybe actively using or has psychiatric symptoms. We're not expecting them to keep appointments and call us and say, you need to see us. We visit assertively, frequently, often, do whatever it takes to make sure we can see the person in the unit. We've put someone there that we know is struggling, so it's up to us to make sure that they get a visit and that they're okay and the apartment's okay and that they're doing all right. The support services are mandatory, but the responsibility for delivering them is on the staff, which means we need to develop the kind of relationship with the person that the person is eager to see us and is not hiding or closing the door when we show up. These are the principles of the program. One other thing about the program that I think challenges traditional approaches is that the services provided are not the standard mental health and addiction services. We take a kind of whatever it takes approach, whether it's, people need to buy clothes or need to recontact family or help contact get their documents, find a place to worship, transportation to their medical appointment. All these things that have little to do with substance abuse or mental health treatment, but are practical, essential elements of support, are what we do. And the sequence, as I said, is determined by the person that is driving the program, the client. We achieve high housing stability. If you do the program properly, you should expect to get an 80 or 90% housing stability rate. And if you don't, then you got to be looking at, are you doing home visits? Is your staff to client ratio too high? What's going on? Because there's a lot of evidence that says that if you do it correctly, you should be getting good outcomes. But housing stability is a start. I mean, the goal of the program overall is recovery. You know, people are incredibly poor. They need to figure out a way to manage income, whether that means getting on benefits or having a job, and ultimately to be included in the community like everybody else. Recovery in mental health, recovery is not the same thing as recovery in addiction treatment. Like, it's not sobriety. Recovery is more like living with a chronic illness, like people have diabetes or hypertension or heart disease or mental illness. And that doesn't mean they don't have work, family, live in the community like everybody else, manage their symptoms. Recovery in mental health means you're having a life of meaning above and beyond your diagnosis. It doesn't mean symptom-free. And same is true for addiction. It's very much a harm reduction program. These are studies that tell you this thing really works well. HUD-VASH is probably the best federal example of that. Although I find it interesting that there's now not 92, closer to 100 cities that have ended veterans' homelessness, and the great majority of them are east of the Continental Divide. There's something about Housing First doesn't blow over the Rockies. It's something, I can't quite put my finger on it. But I'm here trying to, convey the message. When it doesn't work for the 10 or 20%, after you've tried a few times in an apartment, you would need something more supervised to complement that. Because most people live in community-based housing, apartments in normal housing, like some of the social housing we heard about, integrated income, integrated populations. But it's not for everyone, and some people need additional support services on site. One example of taking Housing First to scale, because I've been talking about it as a program, but in Milwaukee recently, and you're going to hear from Houston in a minute, you can take this thing as an approach and have all homeless services participate with this kind of philosophy. So in Milwaukee, for example, they had the Housing Authority, which had an abundance of vouchers. They attached an outreach team that looked a lot like an interdisciplinary team to the Housing Authority, identified people, and began to issue vouchers in a Housing First approach through the Housing Authority. It began to go very well, and other parts of the community began to participate in this Housing First approach. The business community paid for an additional case manager just so they could do outreach in the business district. The district attorney got involved because some people had criminal records while they were homeless and didn't qualify for a housing voucher, and they expunged people's records based on the fact that they had these arrests while they were homeless. So that was, reducing another barrier. They had, the police bringing people to the outreach team rather than bringing people to jail. And so over a 3 or 4 year period, they went from a street count of 327 people to 17. But this was everybody working together on the same page. And I think ultimately, at a city level, to really get down to zero on chronic homelessness, we would need this kind of collaboration among all of the, not only providers, but other members of the community that work in homelessness. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Sam. So I would say, I think one of the themes that I've heard so far in this presentation and the last is that there may be some opportunities as like a capitalist society to lean into the skid a little bit more. We're focusing too much on trying to control people. Some of the main tenets of capitalism are controlling resources and distribution of resources. Sounds like we have a distribution of resources problem in most of these cases. So now we're going to move over to our next presentation with Anna. Anna, would you like to come up here? Would you like me to run your slides? Up to you.
Come up.
All right.
Oh, I need my glasses. Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me. Let's see. All right, so this is I'm a huge Disney fan, so I love this slide because it shows how large Houston is. So Houston sits in Harris County, but we have 3 counties in our continuum of care. So what you see there, the green is actually unincorporated Harris County, which is outside the city limits of Houston. And then the gray is within the city limits of Houston. So you can see all of the cities that can fit into not just Houston, but Harris County. And then if you look at all these little Mickey Mouse ears, each one represents 5 Disney Worlds. And if you've ever been to Disney World, you know it's very, very large. So that is how many Disney Worlds can fit into Houston. So it's a lot. But additionally, we have 3,700 square miles. So we have Montgomery County to the north. It is very rural. The Sam Houston National Forest is there. And then we have Fort Bend County to the west. It's more affluent, not a lot of affordable housing there. So the bulk of the homelessness happens in Harris County. And then, of course, most of the housing is in Harris County as well. The Coalition for the Homeless, we are the lead and the collaborative applicant for the Texas 700 Continuum of Care. And so we are a nonprofit. We have our own board of directors. And we are also the coordinated entry and the HMIS lead. I like to say the analogy that we use to describe what the coalition does is kind of like the airport system. So if you think about the airport system, you have the airlines getting people from point A to point B, but then you have like the air traffic control and all of the moving parts within an airport system that helps the airlines do what they need to do. And so our partners are the airlines, and the Coalition for the Homeless is like the airport system, the air traffic control that helps all the moving pieces. And so you will sometimes hear the way home used, as well as the Coalition for the Homeless. The way home is just what we renamed our COC. So TX 700 is our official HUD designation, and we just renamed it the way home back when we went through the process that I'm about to describe to all of you. So it's all of our partners working together on the goal to end homelessness and moving in the same direction, all of those great things. So back in 2011, Houston had the 5th largest homeless population in the nation. We were not doing very well. Recidivism was very, very poor. The COC funds that we had was not being spent effectively. We were leaving a lot of money on the table. Partners were working in silos. No one really knew. At the time, I was actually working for another nonprofit, and no one really knew what the lead agency at the time was doing. No one knew what we had to do to get permanent supportive housing project. And so all of these things were not working, and we were not doing well. And so at the time, HUD announced their Priority Communities Initiative. It was to help communities that were not doing well. And so Houston was identified as a priority community, not because we were doing well, but because we needed help. And so that fortunately brought some technical assistance in the town. And so we had some TA providers that came in, and they convened a 3-day community charrette. And so everyone that touches homelessness, all of our homeless service partners, adjacent systems like the VA, the hospital systems, the largest mental health provider, the housing authorities, funders from the state, the cities, and the counties all came together into a big room to figure out what we were doing wrong and to see how we can move forward. And so this was, of course, led by those TA providers. We needed to figure out what was not working and get into the path of making it work better. And so this call to action or collective impact was really about moving from siloed systems and a diverse collection of different providers using different methods into an integrated network of providers working together towards ending homelessness. Sorry, my name tag keeps coming off. We also needed to switch our delivery models, right? So we had a lot of people that were just trapped in homelessness over and over for many years, not getting the right interventions. And so we needed to get to the point where we were offering them all housing and getting past that, cherry picking and things of that nature that weren't working for us. And so the final governance that came out of this is what you see here. This is what we still have to this day. The Continuum of Care Steering Committee is our governing body for the Continuum of Care. And so I said that the Coalition for the Homeless is a 501c3 nonprofit. We have our own board of directors that looks out for the financial and the health of the organization as a 501c3. And then we have the COC Steering Committee who looks out for the health of the Continuum of Care. And so the seats on the steering committee are, we have partner seats that are elected every 2 years. We have individuals of lived experience. We have the public housing authorities, representatives from the funders, from the city, the state, and the counties, representatives from all three counties, the VA, the public housing authority, so things of that nature. And so all of the work that happens now is actually done by our partners. And so let's just say we need to look at our housing prioritization tool. It needs to be tweaked. So we get all of our partners together, and the coalition leads the work group, brings the data from our HMIS, and then just leads the conversation with our partners. And then the partners themselves are doing the work. And we put out a call. So whenever this is, something needs to be done, we have work groups and we put out a call to partners. And so then for however long the work needs to be done, the partners will get in a room, do it. And then whatever body of work comes out of that goes to the COC Steering Committee for a vote, a resolution. If it passes, if they vote, then the coalition helps to implement whatever the strategy was. And if it needs to be tweaked, then the COC Steering Committee will send it back to the work group to make whatever changes are necessary. And so the COC Steering Committee meets every month. We have quarterly business meetings where we or strategy meetings where they're a little bit longer, and then all the other times they're 1 hour just business meetings where we do just regular work, and it's open to the public. Anybody can attend. No more of the siloed systems, and so from that 2011 to about 2017, we had a 5-year strategic plan that came out of that charrette work. And so some of the goals from that was to end veteran homelessness. We also did have a lot of political will. So we had Anise Parker at the time was our mayor. Homelessness was important to her. And so she helped us go to the 2 public housing authorities to get homeless preferences put in place so that we can use housing choice vouchers to pay for subsidy and pair with supportive services to increase the capacity that we have for permanent supportive housing. Part of that 5-year strategic plan was to create 2,500 slots of permanent supportive housing, and we ended up creating almost 3,000 slots. Some of that was scattered site. We do have a lot of apartment complexes in Houston, and there were a couple of rehabs, and then we have a large SRO provider that built a couple of SRO or single room occupancy properties in our continuum of care. And so from 2011 to 2017, we were able to slash our homeless numbers from that 5th largest in half. We created those slots. We implemented coordinated access, or we call it coordinated access. It's coordinated entry in 2014. And then we were one of the largest cities in the nation to end veteran homelessness in 2015. And then, of course, we have a lot of natural disasters in Houston. So we were doing really well. We were on this downward trajectory every year to end homelessness. And then this guy came into town. And and I will say, even though Houston is the 4th largest city in the nation, we are very much a small town in the sense that we all help one another, and that does come from the many hurricanes and floods. Houston is a bayou city, so any large storm will flood the city, and so we're used to just like everybody jumping in and helping their neighbors and kind of thing. So this strategy of working together towards ending homelessness was just something that we were used to doing. And so when Hurricane Harvey came into town, it was very devastating for our region. We lost thousands of slots of permanent supportive or affordable housing. Thousands of people lost their homes. And so for the first time, we did see an increase in our unsheltered homeless population as a direct result of the hurricane. So we use an interview approach for our homeless count. We actually go out and interview everybody on the streets, and we ask them what led to their homelessness, and we did ask about the hurricane. So 18% of the individuals that were experiencing unsheltered homelessness at that time stated that they were homeless as a direct result of the hurricane because they either lost their job or they lost their house. And so, even though we had decreased homelessness by 54%, we had housed, our success rates was 90% in keeping people housed. We had really, for a time, but after Hurricane Harvey until right before the pandemic, we had reached this plateau where our homeless numbers are not really going high, or they were not going low. They were kind of staying about the same. We had really maximized all of our continuum of care dollars. Houston is a revenue cap city. We do not get local resources for homelessness. The bulk of our resources comes directly from the continuum of care. And so in 2011, our COC funds, our annual renewal demand was about $25 million. This past year is $59 million. And so we have to be really good stewards about those COC funds, because that's really the bulk of the money that we get, aside from just entitlement dollars from ESG, CDBG, those types of things. And so we had also made this huge reduction in homelessness, but the community didn't believe it, because we started to see an increase in the unsheltered homeless visibility. Part of that was due to the hurricane, where there were more people out on the streets, but there was a rise in encampments. And so even though we were saying, oh yes, we've cut homelessness in half, the community was like, we don't believe you, because we're seeing all of these individuals out here on the streets. And so we had a new permanent supportive housing project that was coming online in 2018. It was a continuum of care project. And so what we started doing over the years with our COC funds is we, for example, if there's a partner who has a PSH project that serves 50 individuals and they're paying rent for those 50, we were able to use our housing choice vouchers to increase their capacity to 100. So let's take 100 vouchers and then move the rental assistance from rental assistance to supportive services, so that they then can serve those 100 people. So the subsidy is being paid by the housing choice voucher, and then the supportive services are being paid through the continuum of care. So we have hundreds and hundreds of vouchers and PSH slots that we created using that method, and so it's been very successful. And so we did have a new SRO building that was coming on. It had project-based vouchers, and we wanted to see if we could close an encampment. So what we did is there was a really bad encampment in town. The City of Houston Health Department had actually done an abatement study that showed how poor the living conditions were and what people are exposed to, diseases and crime. And so we decided we were going to tackle that, and we were actually able to use that abatement study to put in a prioritization in our coordinated entry process for individuals living in encampments. And that is because of the conditions that they're exposed to, the vulnerability of those individuals, exposure to crime and trafficking and drug use. So what Sam was talking about, where it's just not coordinated entry, it has to be about looking at holistically at what the needs of the individual is. And so that is what we do in our prioritization process, is we look at the vulnerability of the individual, what it means to experience homelessness in Houston, and what does it mean that someone's going to die on the streets? What are those characteristics? And so we were able to successfully close our very first encampment in 2018. There were 73 individuals there. 73% of them were housed in that new PSH project. 5% refused, 22% left. And we didn't see them show up at another, encampment. And so the 5% that refuse are usually the ones that don't trust the system yet and don't really believe in our process, and they're the ones that are going to go to like another location. And so when we did this, there was all of a sudden all this interest, right, on, oh my gosh, they closed an encampment. So then we have management districts in Houston that fund different areas in the city, and so the downtown management district was very interested in what we were doing and wanted to fund our work. And then just very interestingly, the mayor had his Complete Communities Fund, and the Nation of Qatar actually provided a lot of funding towards the mayor's Complete Community Fund. And so we actually received $2.5 million from the Nation of Qatar to tackle homelessness because of what happened with Hurricane Harvey. They were very they were very moved by what happened in Houston because of the hurricane and how devastating it was. And then on top of that, the Downtown Management District also funded this new project that we called H3. We like little acronyms in Houston. So Housing Harvey's Homeless, H3. So this was the largest encampment that we had. It was adjacent to the ballpark. There were over 200 individuals there, 286 to be exact, and there were a couple of areas in the downtown Houston core that were very, very, in poor condition because of all the tents and stuff. And so we were able to house 70% of the individuals from that encampment. 8% refused, 22% left. And so this location was completely fenced off. So this was part of the Texas Department of Transportation, and so we were able to get them to fence it off. And then We actually, this initiative was so interesting in the fact that we actually had landlords set up their tables under the tent, where you see these tents here under the bridge. Landlords would come and set up their table and sign up people for housing on the spot. And we developed the landlord engagement strategy based out of what we learned from Hurricane Harvey, where we were dispatched to the disaster shelters. And so we created this whole landlord engagement team, and all they did was go out and recruit landlords. It was a game changer for us, and we're still using that strategy now. And so because of this, we're actually able to use COVID resources to really beef up our outreach teams in Houston. We didn't have all of this. I was kind of doing this piecemeal with partners and their outreach teams. And so when we got some COVID resources and some private funding, we actually brought the outreach teams in-house so that we can direct that work ourselves. A lot of this works closely with the city and the counties. We use the not just the public health departments, but the solid waste departments. They come out and help us clean out the areas and do all those things. And so this encampment response strategy that we're using is being used by several cities now, and we use a housing first approach. We do go in, we move the individual. It's about a 4 to 6 week process. We go in and we start the relationship building with those individuals so that they can trust us, and then we start to figure out what their needs are, who's going to need what type of intervention, and then what each of the individual's specific service needs are. And from there, we create a by name list that we then lock so that no one can come into that encampment once we're already working with people. Because that did happen with H3. Once word got out that we were housing all these people, then people started showing up to the encampment that weren't there before. And thankfully, we had mapped out all the location and we had a by name list so that we didn't need for this to happen. So this encampment response strategy has been going on now since 2018. We've decommissioned 127 encampments thus far. 65% of those individuals are housed, 22% self-resolve or leave, and then we still have about 13% refusal rate. Right now, it's almost a 50-50 split when it comes to PSH or rapid rehousing. It has shifted. It used to be more PSH, but we have housed a lot of individuals that are that meet the PSH criteria, and so it's starting to shift. It's starting to shift more towards rapid rehousing. And so over the years, because of those resources, because of us housing all of these individuals from encampments, we finally got over that hump. The pandemic resources did help. We did, jumpstart our homeless response system. We put the bulk of those resources into housing. We don't have a lot of shelter in Houston, and what we do have is privately funded or faith-based. And so coordinated entry for us is just housing. And so overall, we've housed over 32,000 individuals thus far, and we've decreased homelessness by 61% since that time in 2011. This is kind of what our population looks like compared to other large cities per 1,000 residents. So this is a number of homeless individuals per 1,000 residents. Last year, we saw a 17% decrease in our unsheltered homeless population, even though other cities across the nation were seeing an increase. And that does have to do with the fact that we're investing so heavily into housing. And even though we do see a lot of eviction filings in Houston, we're not seeing that these individuals are becoming homeless as a result of being evicted. And so I just wanted to kind of, share that. And then when it comes to some lessons learned over the years, I will say that, setting a goal and making it public is really, really important. Everyone is agreeing to that specific goal, and setting a goal together means holding each other accountable. It doesn't mean that you're, as you're tweaking, we like to say building the plane as we fly it. It doesn't mean that you're doing anything wrong. It just means that you're learning and evolving as a system, and you're just improving the process along the way. PSH, we always say or housing itself, right, requires the three things. It requires the subsidy, the physical unit, and then, of course, the supportive services. It is very challenging to defend housing first when so many individuals think that it's housing only, but it's not. You can't have housing first if you don't have all of those things together, and, Sam explained it really nicely. And then supportive services and housing first are not optional, as I said. We are very, we do monitor all of our partners to make sure they're adhering to housing first, and we score them, and this can impact their funding on their COC score. Be data-driven and not feeling-driven. We have a wealth of data in Houston, and we always say, what are the numbers showing? Don't tell me that, there's 1,000 individuals experiencing unsheltered homelessness in downtown Houston. What are the numbers showing us? So we have to really look at the data, because the data will tell the story. And then trying something new, as I mentioned, means adjusting along the way. The work is not done by the steering committee. So again, it's done by the partners, by the system together as a collaborative, and then the COC board will vote on the resolution. And then, of course, being okay with being uncomfortable. No one's going to get their way. So you have to be able to give up some things in order to make the entire thing work. And so that's all I have. Thanks.
Thank you so much. So we do have, I think, just one question. We have a couple questions that have come in so far. One about development, so I'm going to hold that until after we've heard from Noah and Margaret. And then we do have a question for you, Anna, as I pull up the next slide presentation, just asking how Texas has prioritized queer, trans, or LGBTQ housing security.
So I'm not sure about Texas as a whole. For Houston, we rely completely on vulnerability. And so when we never used the VI SPDAT because it was too cumbersome for us. We started our coordinated entry with the VI, but even that after a while didn't make sense for us because we don't have things like frostbite and that it just didn't make sense. And so what we did is we looked at the data, we brought the work group together, and we looked at what it meant that someone might die on the streets of Houston. And so those things, all of those things is what we ended up using to prioritize individuals for housing. And so if LGBTQ or any of those things came up in that data, that is what we use to then put in our prioritization.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody, so far. Hi, everybody. Good morning. My name is Noah Fay. I use he, him pronouns. I'm the Senior Housing Director of DESC in Seattle, Washington. We are a human service, homeless service provider. We focus exclusively on people, single adults, people experiencing the homelessness the longest in our community and living with some of the most severe and profound challenges. Particularly people living with serious mental illness, co-occurring substance use issues, and physical disabilities. We do a lot of different things, but I want to primarily focus on our housing work. We use a housing first approach to provide a lot of permanent supportive housing in our community. So we're a niche organization. Tragically, that niche is not very small, and that we work with people with some of the most severe and profound challenges who really need this level of support. So that's the water I swim in when I talk about our work. I'm going to go relatively quickly through this because ditto to what Sam said. This is our orientation towards this work. Fully believe that housing is a basic human right and not something that needs to be a reward for clinical success. Someone doesn't need to demonstrate their worthiness, their readiness in order to obtain housing. Fully acknowledge that that is not the way our world works, and that not only is that not philosophically the way housing works in a for-profit open market system, we also just don't literally have enough of it. Even if it did, there's a great article, if you haven't seen it, by The Atlantic, it's probably 6-7 months old now, which uses an analogy around homelessness and housing and ties it to a game of musical chairs. And that there's a game of musical chairs when it comes to housing resources in most communities, particularly communities west of Denver, where there's just a scarcity of available units. And as you play the game, it's not a question of will people not have access to housing, it's a matter of who won't have access to housing. And invariably those are people who have more challenges in their life and have been systemically oppressed in our community. And we need to reject that, both philosophically and from a resource base, and we'll talk a little bit about that. The fundamental principle is we want to give people a fair fighting chance from a kind of a philosophical orientation. Totally agree with Sam that this is a person-centered approach. Our job is to find people and then design things that people need. Almost without doubt, that's housing, usually a whole bunch of other things, and we'll talk a bit about that. But invariably, the idea here is to resolve the chaos that is homelessness, give people a safe, stable platform of a permanent place to live, to give them the fighting chance to recover to their greatest ability with the supports of the service providers like us and others. This has been working really well in our community. This is not new. It's amazing. I've had the privilege to do this work for going on 21 years here soon. And the same arguments are coming back time and time again. This idea around, does housing first work? Does a low barrier approach work? Is this a housing issue? I don't know if you've heard that. I know in Seattle we have. I'm sure. I know Portland's heard it, that this is not a housing issue, it's a drug issue. That's not a new argument, and we'll talk about some of those. But the idea here is that we need to give people a safe, stable place to live, and that has worked really effectively. Sam cited retention rates that are through the roof. There's lots of other data that supports people stabilizing with some of the chronic challenges they're living with in their life, often in ways that historically they were not, with other more traditional orthodox approaches, which we'll talk about. However, I want to be the bearer of probably, I guess not bad news, but acknowledge this is, again, what's old is new again. There are some critiques of this model, and this work has gotten harder. I am very much an administrator now, but I used to get to do direct service work. I was a street outreach worker. I ran some of our housing programs, and I find myself sounding like an old fuddy-duddy saying, back when I did this, we did X, Y, and Z, and my staff are quick to remind me, things have changed, and we got to acknowledge that, and they have. We are dealing with a whole bunch of bad stuff in our community that I think truly has made this work harder. The effects of the pandemic will be with us for a lot longer than I would like, and I think we're still just coming out of that, both just from we all went through something together, to the tangible dynamic of people had less access to the services they desperately needed, and they didn't exactly have a lot of those before the pandemic, and the lingering effects of that are really pronounced. We are swimming in a fentanyl crisis. I really am personally a fan of rebranding that as a toxic drug supply crisis and not an overdose crisis. That is, I think, highlights some of the stigma issues, yet that is very real. We've had people die in our programs at a greater rate than we've ever had before from overdoses, and that's a real challenge for us. So when someone says, does housing first work, and I say, hell yeah, then they say, well, why did 5 people pass away in your program? That's something to wrestle with. I'm not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I'm not dismissing this model. I would be curious to know what's your alternative, but I want to acknowledge we've got a real problem on our hands, and we need to start thinking about how we tackle that. Our workforce has been dragged through the mud both with some of this narrative, but then also just this work is remarkably hard, historically suppressed wages. I think government outsources this work because they don't want to pay what they would otherwise have to pay for it. And if you look at what actually is paid for similar work at government levels, and we're going to talk about this in a bit, we are dramatically underpaid. And so that's the example of this article. That's actually Naomi. She's a nurse at DESC. That's a Washington Post story where she walked through the reporter, Eli Saslow, for a couple days in some of our programs and highlighted the day-to-day challenges and the moral injury of people who do this work, get into this work to help people, and when the systems around them don't meet their needs, there's a not only are we not helping our people, but there's a personal toll that takes. When you get into this work to help and you can't, it's moral injury. And then our crisis system. I hope yours is working better than Seattle. Ours was not. I think Sam's medical model example is spot on. We have people who live in the community with symptoms that are well managed over time. Serious mental illness is nonlinear and waxes and wanes, and sometimes people need extra help. And so we don't want to lean on the hospital model. We don't want to lean on involuntary treatments. But that is actually a system that needs to exist and function in our community, and ours has been falling apart for quite some time, meaning housing providers are working with people in crisis for weeks, whereas they used to work with them in crisis for a couple days. All of that builds to a public narrative and a real tension in our community. I don't have all the answers, so hope that wasn't where you were hoping I was going with this. Yeah, sorry. Bury the lead on that. Yeah, see ya. Okay, good luck. Got some stuff we're cooking up, though, that we're working on that I think, so the reason why I'm doing all this was, yes, it's housing first, not housing only. These services are complicated. So the services start with doing whatever it takes to help people stay housed. That's how I like to talk about it. Given it is person-centered, given we're prioritizing people with really profound needs, that is complicated. And invariably it relies on connections with other services in our broader community. So I want to highlight a few of the things we're seeing and stuff we're trying to do about it. As I mentioned already, fentanyl, which I'm calling the toxic drug supply. I didn't come up with that term, but like it, I think it highlights what's going on here differently than calling it an overdose crisis. Is we have people who are unable to reliably know what they're putting in their body and having negative consequences to that. We would not accept that when it comes to all sorts of other things that we put in our bodies. When it comes to drugs, the stigma prevents us from taking the harm reduction public health interventions we should be taking to keep our neighbors alive. Different talk for a different day. We are working to develop an internal overdose response. I won't get into the details of what that looks like, but in short, naloxone everywhere all the time, and a really quick, reliable way to follow up on people who have overdoses, including having them maybe be able to go somewhere where they can get more involved immediate resources immediately post-overdose, ranging from basic support all the way up to some potential medication for opioid use disorder. Our behavioral health system, as I talked about, has been falling apart. We rely on it heavily. We are a behavioral health care provider, so when I'm saying falling apart, I'm looking in the mirror on all of this. And some of the work we've been doing to address that is we need to think more creatively about crisis response. We work with people at our organization who have lots of challenges, and sometimes there are situations that are beyond what a Housing First, permanent supportive housing program can manage in the moment. Forever, the only resource we've been able to ask for, in addition to what we currently have, is someone with a badge and a gun who is not necessarily who we want to have come to that scene, but we may not have any other immediate resource. Can we think differently about crisis response? We are by no means alone. This conversations are going on a lot around our country, which is good. And we're trying to find ways to develop better, immediate, dispatchable crisis response for people that is trauma-informed and doesn't lean on law enforcement. And we've made some strides in doing that. The buildings themselves, there have been some really high-profile examples across the country. Skid Row Housing Trust in Los Angeles comes to mind of well-known Housing First organizations who have not been able to sustain their work. These programs, I heard the 99-year commitment, that's fantastic. We offer 50-year commitments. The point is we're not going away. We're doing this forever. We've committed to doing this forever. It's expensive to run these projects, and we need to find ways to ensure we're investing in these issues so that challenges related to behavioral health or long-term sustainability of the building don't undermine people's housing sustainability. And we got to think about how do we invest in repair and maintenance, not the most glamorous thing as opposed to a ribbon-cutting event with a new building, yet critical if the goal is to keep people successfully housed. And then the workforce. We have to, our workers are the supports, are the services in PSH. I'm really proud of the city of Seattle for, I think, we're nowhere near scaling where we need to be, but the commitment in investing in capital resource to build enough housing to try to get ourselves out of this is at least something we all talk about kind of in a consistent voice. We have not kept pace with the supports in the workforce, and you can't develop these projects if you don't have the supports to open them. We came close to having to keep people on the streets longer because I had new apartments, but not staff to work in the building. It was the lowest point in my career. We've made major investments in addressing that since, primarily by advocating externally with our funders that the work that we do is a profession. People should be able to do direct service as a career. If you want to buy a house and start a family, you don't have to do my career track. I had to leave doing that work. I still say the coolest job I ever had was street outreach. If I could have done that as a career, I wouldn't be up here talking to you right now. I'd be the streets of Seattle trying to engage with folks. But that's not how we structure and pay this. We need to change that. We need to pay people in a way that they can afford to live in the city they work in, and tying that to FMR, like really meaning it and going to bat with our funders, including refusing to do work if we don't get paid the way we need to be paid. That's what we're working on. Still, people have beef, man. Oh, man. So we still are hearing lots and lots of critiques on Housing First. And I just wanted to share a few of them to commiserate with y'all. If you are the ones hearing these critiques, I get them. So if I were doing street outreach right now, I wouldn't hear this as much. In my role now, I get to hear this all the time when I'm going into neighborhoods trying to develop these projects. So the one that I think gets the most attention is that it doesn't reduce homelessness. I think Anna mentioned an example of this. If Housing First works, why are there all these tents? That is a common thing we hear. That is so backwards in my brain that I have a hard time arguing with it. I heard somebody say it's a little like blaming cancer drugs for cancer. There's a solution that works, but it's not working for everybody because not everybody has it. Or the other example is that it completely ignores that we haven't scaled this intervention and we've done nothing to turn off the inflow. So I've heard a term that was used. We used to say the goal of our continuum in Seattle was to end homelessness in 10 years. We stopped saying that. The numbers were showing where it wasn't working. There was a term for a while from our COC that maybe wasn't as inspiring as one might hope, but I think about it all the time, and it's old. We don't use it anymore. Is that the goal is to make homelessness rare, brief, and one time? We're doing a lot to make it brief and one time. We're not doing anything to make it rare, because we are not turning off the inflow. So to blame the solution for people who don't have access to it is just foolish. The second is it doesn't reduce people's challenges. If you tell us that this housing first thing works, why is there an ambulance in front of your building all the time? Or like, why is this person on the street corner responding to internal stimuli? Or why did something bad happen that made it in the newspaper? What I find with that is it just ignores the fact that if we are intentionally trying to support people who have some of the longest histories of homelessness, have been marginalized by our community at every turn, and then we provide them this resource, we move people into housing as quickly as possible, and then we provide these services. Evidence shows overwhelmingly, time and time again, and we'll talk about an example at DSC, people's problems decrease a lot. That doesn't mean they go away. And so we could choose to look at this in one of two ways. We could just be realistic with people and show that we have a demonstrated evidence-based model that dramatically reduces people's problems, but don't promise that this is a solution to make mental illness go away. That is not how it works in our community. This does not make poverty go away. This gives people a fighting chance, and if that's what you're looking for, is to not see people with challenges, that's not what you're buying with Housing First, and we should be honest about that in the community. And the last piece, I think Sam touched on this, there's this sense that like the way to solve these problems is you gotta force change, make people be different. I reject that philosophically. The evidence doesn't support that. But I think aside from those two pieces, it confuses this dynamic that while Housing First is not coercive, it's also not passive. And I think Sam's piece about the home visits, like this is a remarkably assertive model. Like we are clinically appropriately in your face is the way I like to say that. Like it is person-centered, we care about you, we are drawing you into services at a pace you can tolerate, and if you say no, we respect that, we come back, all that stuff. Services are voluntary, but they are assertive as hell. So this idea that we are just housing people and like, well, cross our fingers, hope things get better, is just a mischaracterization of the model, and I think it's important for us to talk about that so people understand that differently. Okay, last slide for me. So this beef and debate has gone on forever. Sam used the word you shall never say, the enabling word in his presentation, where often this is one of the common critiques, is that we are enabling people to continue to do things we don't want them to do by having a model that centers choice and autonomy. And what we really need to do for people who violated the social contract is get them, put them somewhere, tell them to stop. That's the way to handle business. And if you don't, people will continue to suffer and have challenges. Well, we reject that, as we hopefully made super clear. However, we have one building that we operate. This is old now. Has anyone ever heard of 1811 East Lake? Yeah, it's old. I can't believe it's 20 years old, if that makes anyone else feel old in the room. However, it's a building that we ran a housing first approach, where when I say what's old is new again, there's a lot of interest in the mid-2000s around addressing the downtown core of Seattle. There were a lot of people sleeping in tents. At the time, the drug that seemed to be most pronounced was alcohol, where people were obviously intoxicated. There was concern about what that would do to the downtown business core, so there was this group effort, community effort to say, let's do something about it. Let's build housing for this group. We said we would do that. But we're only going to do it if it's a housing first approach and people can move in, and we're not going to require that they stop drinking. We're going to provide a whole bunch of services to help people be as safe and stable as possible, but that's not going to be a requirement. That got a lot of attention. That was not unique. We were doing that already at lots of different places, but somehow, because it was about this group that was very public, this was also a group that was cycling through our emergency services more than anybody else in the entire community. So fairly high profile group. We got sued. We got a lot of media attention. You see some of the articles, examples of those up here. One of my favorite, drunks in the planned $8 million building would be permitted to booze up. Aside from the $8 million is quaint. Permitted to booze up. I don't know about you. My landlord never had the ability to tell me if I could drink or not when I rented a unit. But just the stigma is just like oozing through all of this. But the other argument was like, you are foolish. You are wasting taxpayer resources on a population that has violated the social contract, and this is just a waste of our money. We need to do something different. The other argument was like, okay, well, let's see what happens when we house folks, but if you don't make people change, you're going to allow people to drink themselves to death. This controversy, this lawsuit, this media attention also got academic interest, which is an enormous kind of blessing in hindsight, and that we studied the outcomes of that. And those two charges, that you're wasting taxpayer money, from one year to the next, we saw a $4 million cost offset, $8 million to $4 for this population group. $4 million is a lot. It's half of 8. And so if we're going to be wasting taxpayer resources, if that's the charge, that was one hell of a counterpoint and got a lot of attention. The other argument that, I think I was more in my heart and was worried about is, are we in fact going to allow people to drink themselves to death? And we saw, with the one variable, that everyone was offered a place to live with supportive services that were delivered on a pace they could tolerate. People drank on average about 35% less and about 40% less on their binge days. This is not a picture of sobriety, I want to be abundantly clear, but this is a population who on average had been to inpatient treatment 16 times before they moved in. So we kept trying the same thing over and over again. There's a famous quote about doing that, and so instead maybe we should do something different and provide these sort of supports. And we did, and we saw remarkable results. There's an anecdote, and I do not mean to make recovery sound this simple whatsoever, but there was an anecdote in the article. It got published in a prestigious journal, and Housing First, I think, really kind of some momentum was generated behind it. A gentleman who lived in the building, when asked why was he drinking less, he said, well, I have a fridge now. Before my beer got warm on the street, now I can keep it cold. Which I just think highlights that, frankly, pardon my language, the shit we take for granted when we have a safe, stable place to live. Mm-hmm. I can make decisions for myself that he could not because I had the benefit of a place to live. We start by doing that for people, and people change, and people's lives get better. So when you hear that Housing First doesn't work, know that the arguments are old and stale, and fight back. So thank you. Appreciate it.
All right, so now we've been around the country and we're going to bring it home. I do have a question that I'm going to throw to Anna because I suspect it might come up in this next presentation anyway, which is just, Anna, can you say a little bit about the housing market and the vacancy rate in your local community at different levels? Just what can you tell us about the vacancy rate there and how that's contributing to your work?
So Houston is still affordable. During the pandemic, we started to see, so first of all, we have a lot of apartment complexes, a lot of multifamily apartments. There was a really interesting, the Low Income Housing Coalition, the YIMBY folks, he presented a slide that I saved, and it showed the cities that built multifamily apartments over the years. And Houston was one of those, like in the 80s and the 90s. And the cities that built more of those are the ones that have less of a homeless population. So we do have a lot of apartment complexes and a lot that still do meet the HUD FMR. We are starting to feel the housing crunch, though. Our vacancy rate is low. And we have to always, we're not able to get people out of certain parts of town. That's the unfortunate part. Like in better school districts, we don't have a lot of families that we serve, but it's unfortunately that the C and D class units are what people can afford, and we have a lot of those, but they're located in not so great parts of town, and so anytime that we try to put someone, in a better part of town, there's just the FMR is too high for that location. There are some, the zip codes for the housing authorities, they do pay. We can pay above FMR in some areas. So we are still fortunate that we can still find units. Again, we have a landlord engagement process that's, amazing. But during the pandemic, we started to see a shortage of one bedrooms because we're housing about close to 80% of the people that we're housing are singles or couples that are needing that one bedroom, and we just are starting to run low on those. So, yeah.
Great. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Margaret Salazar. I am the CEO of Reach Community Development, which is one of our region's largest providers of affordable housing. I know many of you from prior roles in the policymaking world where I headed up OHCS, and I was also the HUD regional administrator. So first of all, I just want to say thank you for having me here, and thank you for putting on a program today that's bringing in perspectives from other markets. I think we in Portland tend to be extremely insular and kind of look down, and there's a lot going on in our community. I really appreciate bringing in perspectives from other markets. So today I'm going to give you some reflections on what I've seen around the region, and then now what I'm seeing as a practitioner here at home at the ground level. So I know you all are housing advocates and champions, so you know how important safe and stable, affordable housing is, not just for individuals who need a place to call home, but I would also just remind us of the importance that housing plays in its connection to other sectors, whether it's the work that we're doing to address climate change, the work that we're doing to address financial stability, housing and health, as well as our work around racial equity. I do want to say, from the perspective of a new housing developer, this is a very, very difficult time to build affordable housing. I just want to give an acknowledgement there. That's one of the things that's in the room today, between rising costs of interest costs, housing construction costs, skyrocketing insurance costs, particularly for permanent supportive housing. This is a challenging time, and it's equally challenging to operate affordable housing because we really took a wallop during COVID, and we're still climbing out of that as we strive to maintain safe and stable affordable housing. So I just want to acknowledge there are real challenges out there for the industry, and I do think that there are some great opportunities for us to step into the world of housing first and be more effective. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the things I saw when I traveled across the state as OHCS director and then across the region as HUD regional administrator. And I was working in communities like small remote native villages in Alaska, as well as with folks working in downtown Seattle. So really the gamut of experiences. And we are not alone with the struggle with housing first and homelessness. And what I saw across the region, the main theme was the lack of alignment, and I will put that on the backs of our government agencies, and I can say that now because I'm on the other side of the table. And they're working extremely hard, right, to align huge systems, whether it's housing, infrastructure, land use and transportation, or whether it's housing and services. These are models that have been built in silos over decades, and our government friends are trying to align them, and I know that they can do better because there are unprecedented resources out there, and we're counting on you. I want to give one example in terms of some alignment that I saw that was pretty remarkable, and it's a really messy example, which I think we can relate to here in Portland. So who has spent time in Spokane, Washington? Anybody here? Oh, a lot of Spokane, folks familiar with Spokane. And Noah, I'm sure you've heard about Camp Hope in Spokane because it was in the newspaper every single day for many, many months. But I think it's an example that we should take heart with here in Portland. Who's heard of Camp Hope? Does anybody know? Okay, so just couple folks. So this was an example where there was an extremely large homeless encampment on a right-of-way right next to a freeway in Spokane called Camp Hope. It grew to 650 people in a city of 250,000, so a small city. Spokane is a growing city. It was one of those cities where folks moved to Spokane during COVID because they wanted to move to a smaller, more livable community. Spokane has a 2% vacancy rate, and so many folks were moving there that we saw, housing prices just skyrocket. And just to put that in perspective, because you asked about vacancies, Portland has a 6 to 7% vacancy rate right now. Spokane has a 2%. I want you to remember, we have 7% vacancy in Portland right now. This idea that we don't have any housing is a falsehood. We need to confront, we need to work with that, we need to fill those units. That's my first soapbox of the day. But in Spokane, they had a real challenge. How are they going to wrap around this homeless encampment of 650 people? The reason why I want to tell this story is because it's messy, it's not perfect, and not everybody ended up in a great situation, but there was some incredible work done, and I think too often we tend to be, either this is a success story or it's a failure. Spokane, this was such a political firestorm. It was in the newspaper every day. There was political infighting, there was muckraking, the newspapers were loving it, they were eating it up, and it made it really hard for the practitioners involved in this to do good work. But they were able to tune out the noise and get to work. They had dedicated funding from the state of Washington to resolve encampments in right-of-ways. I know Noah's familiar with this. And then they also had engagement from foundations, from health systems, from local government folks, from service providers, and from housers. They brought services on site. They had folks from the state that were printing out folks' vital records in real time. They had mobile health units on site, and they built those relationships going, talking to person by person and meeting people where they're at, exactly what Sam talked about. And they were able to move folks some into shelter, some into permanent housing, some into addiction and recovery with a unit waiting on the other end, and some folks into transitional housing. It was not one size fits all, but they were meeting people where they're at. And I just think it's an inspiring case because sometimes I think we feel like we can't do this work because of the public scrutiny and because of the political acrimony. Who here thinks that we can? We can do this. We can do this. If they can do it in Spokane, we can do it. I want to talk a little bit now about my experiences at REACH and the work that we're doing and some opportunities I think that I'm seeing for alignment now on the ground level as a practitioner that I want us to take to heart. So again, we serve 3 counties here in the Portland metro region. We have about 2,800 homes that are in our portfolio. We work with residents all across the region, and we have in-house property management and resident services. There are 4 key take-home points that I'm seeing from my chair that I wanted to relay to you today. So the first has to do with how we think about housing development. You heard it a little bit in prior presentations. We need to think beyond widgets and unit counts and ribbon cuttings. I've been guilty of this as a policymaker. We think about how many units can we produce. We think about getting the PR splash when we open a home. But we need to figure out how to engage in a planning process that will think about trauma-informed design, that will bring in resident voices in the design process, and will get our policymakers to think long-term, not just about 99-year affordability, which is wonderful, but how do we make sure that we have sustainable operations to continue to operate these properties for that length of affordability? We're not meeting the mark yet, but I know that we can do it, and there are great examples that we can learn from. The second is around navigation and placements. As I said, we do have vacant units in our affordable housing properties and in our broad market here in Portland. We need to bring affordable housing providers into the closer circle of homeless services planning so that we can be part of the solution. We right now don't have a great way to matchmake between folks coming out of homelessness, coming out of shelters, coming out of transitional housing, and coming into affordable housing, and bringing the appropriate level of services and rental assistance with them. Those systems are too disconnected. We have to align them, and we have to make sure that affordable housing providers are in the conversation so that we can help shape that policy and make sure that those connections are going to work. So I'm calling on policymakers today to make sure that affordable housing providers are in the inner circle as you're talking and planning policy, and that you're getting residents of affordable housing in those conversations as well. The third piece is around eviction prevention. I think too often we think about placing folks into affordable housing and then we're done. At REACH, we know that that's really when our work begins. We have to think long-term about making sure that folks can be successful in affordable housing. One of the things that we're seeing across the board in our industry is that we do not have enough units that are also supported with project-based rental assistance. We just have a scarcity of project-based rental assistance, and if Congresswoman Bonamici were here, that's the first thing I would talk to her about. She knows that I've talked to her about that before. But what we have is a lot of folks that are residing in affordable housing that cannot afford the rent. A lot of folks are falling behind on their rent, and they are at real risk of eviction. As affordable housing providers, as mission-based housers, we do not want to be in the business of evicting people, but we can't afford to have folks not be able to pay their rent, and we know that that's not going to ultimately keep people sustainably housed. We need eviction prevention resources at the hands of affordable housing providers so that we can prevent folks from falling into homelessness or housing insecurity. This is a growing challenge in our community. We need to take it seriously, so I'm calling on policymakers to set aside some dollars for eviction prevention within affordable housing. And then the final piece I wanted to talk about in terms of alignment is the thinking about permanent supportive housing. I think for too long, and I would say I thought about it this way when I was at the state, we think about permanent supportive housing and all other affordable housing. And we know that there's a population of folks that requires permanent supportive housing, wraparound services, intensive case management, and rental assistance as our housing first approach. And then over here, there's affordable housing, right? We have restricted rents, but in many cases, we don't have project-based rental assistance, we don't have eviction prevention dollars, and we don't have supportive services. Just to kind of bring it home for you, at REACH, we have an incredibly talented group of folks that's on call 24/7. That's our building maintenance folks. That's the only 24/7 on-call folks I have to call. That's who you call when a pipe bursts, when there's an ice storm. I don't have anyone to call in the middle of the night when there's a mental health crisis or when folks with high acuity need support in our buildings. What we're seeing now, and really the trends that Noah was talking about, a lot of folks are moving into affordable housing without any support services or rental assistance, but they need those support services and rental assistance. The good news is that we have an opportunity to convert some of these affordable homes into permanent supportive housing. We have the resources here at a local level that voters have put on the table. If we can tie rental assistance and support services to our existing units, we can quickly bring up to speed more permanent supportive housing units and be able to be part of that housing first solution. We are eager to do that at REACH. We've identified at least 75 units that we could bring on board quickly as PSH, and we're not the only ones. We know that other providers across our community can do that as well. And then the final piece I just wanted to leave you with is really a theme you've heard about today, which is meeting people where they're at. The first thing you do is not offering people housing, it's finding out what they need. So to that end, REACH has been reaching out to our residents, and this was an example of something we did in 2021 with residents focus groups and surveys to really understand what residents were most concerned about. And not surprisingly, what we heard was that some of the top concerns were folks were worried about their safety, their security, and rent increases, which is really what's informing some of the advocacy I talked to you about today. And also, not surprising, our residents are worried about things like building their own financial futures, saving for college, saving for opening a business, and being able to help their other family members build financial security. We also, of course, engage residents in conversations about designing our next affordable housing projects, which is something that, of course, is a best practice as we think about how Housing First can be successful. So our call to action, my call to action to you today is to think about that alignment work, to think about how you can lead from every chair to build that alignment that we can bring together to make an impact. And for those of you that are practitioners, I would say you have the attention of policymakers, so now let's show them how it's done. Thanks, everybody.
All right, thank you, panel. Yeah. So we're going to do a couple of questions. We've got some great stuff here, and then it's going to be lunchtime, and I am positive the lunchtime conversation here is going to be amazing. I'm so excited for it. Okay, so one of the questions we have here, and I think, Margaret, you were talking about this a little bit as well. So the question here is actually, should we have... should there be a rule mandating designers and planners to live at least for a week in the buildings that they're building? Specifically, this person is saying, you know, that I've lived in public housing where the design and the lack of services did further harm to me and others while still paying this rent. But those folks never had to hear the screams and the things I heard in the building. So I think this is really speaking to how do we make beautiful places that are welcoming for people, and I'd love to hear some thoughts.
So maybe I'll take a stab at that, and I will just tell you I had the opportunity to talk to some residents of REACH properties who are here today, so I definitely was doing some listening, and I know they have a lot to say, so we can talk later. Though, I mean, it's critically important, I think, for folks to understand not only in the design process, and I know we have some designers and architects in the room today, but also thinking about really understanding the conditions out there. I think there's a lot of challenges in properties right now, and we need to continue to invest in those communities because I think we have an opportunity to, to do better. And we can't do that unless we are listening to the voices of residents. So I don't know about living there because we don't want to take units offline for folks, but I think making sure that we are engaging in a meaningful way with people who are residing in various settings is critical.
Did anyone else want to add anything?
The landlord engagement team that we have in Houston, part of their role is to ensure that not just that the properties pass HQS, but that the properties are more than just HQS. And so we have actually taken, we have an inventory of units across the city. We've actually taken some apartment complexes off of our inventory and told partners don't place individuals there because the living conditions or the crime or what they're exposed to. And so that is something that we've really, that has helped us tremendously. I mentioned that landlord engagement was a game changer for us, but that's just one of the things that they do.
This is not directly related to the question, but it's sort of, we've touched on it in different ways about how the housing stability rate is not perfect. People need to move. So if you move into a building and it's not to your liking for some reason, we don't have a very flexible system of helping people move to another place, keeping the choice alive without sort of being punitive about it. And I think that's something that would help with some of the losses that we have.
Absolutely. Thank you. I also have like a group of questions here, and they're all kind of around the same theme. So I'm going to try to do my best to consolidate this, but definitely to the folks who put these questions in, this is, I think, great lunchtime conversation. So we heard a lot in all of the presentations, really, about collaboration and systems change. And that sounded like we were talking both about like kind of hard systems change, like using the same database tools, using the same intake forms, asking the same questions, right? Collecting the same data in the same place. But we also heard around like collaboration, like people coming together, developing a coordinated network so that folks can get from services to services. And these questions are really about how, right? I know I hear it every day in every meeting that I'm in. We just need to collaborate more, as if this is like some magic that's going to swoop in and like happen under my feet, right? But how? How do we start to pivot? I think about that cartoon, where it's like there's someone at the podium and like, who wants change? And everyone's like, yeah, who wants to change? And like crickets, right? So I think each of you have been experiencing some shifts in time, working with other communities who are trying to shift things in time. So tell us a little bit about what you think the how is for how we get to different collaborative systems, how we get to better coordination. What do we need to change about ourselves as participants in this system? That's the big question that's going to take us to lunch. So.
I get asked, that's like the number one question I get asked, honestly, is how we did it in Houston. And I mentioned a little bit about that, about how, help one another kind of thing. I will say that once you start to succeed, more entities want to come to the table. The public goal is one thing where instead of having like individual little goals, if you put a public goal up and you're like, this is our target, let's all strive to get to that target. What are you going to do to get to that target? Instead of trying to have like your own individual little thing that you're doing here, is to hold one another accountable for that target. I think that really kind of brings people together. The competitive part of that, like, what are you going to do to help us get to that target? And then whomever the entity is that helps to move the needle a little bit, they're like, wow, I can do this. And so now I want to do more of it. And then you have other partners going, well, they did it. We want to be in the limelight now. Let's see how we can do it. And so that tends to bring more and more people together. The data is very, very important. I will say data-driven, being data-driven and not feeling-driven is a big one. We do look at the data. We say it all the time. What is the data showing? We don't make decisions based on feelings. We make decisions based on data. And that's very hard sometimes for people to get around. Like when we were building our coordinated entry, everyone that was at the table wanted to use their own intake form. And it's like, this isn't going to work. So let's look at all the intake forms and let's see what everybody has that's the same. So then we put all the same things on one side, and then we put all of the different things on one side. And we're like, okay, what of these different things, what is it that we actually need for someone to access housing? we don't need to know if someone's ever had a lease in their name, you know, things like that. And so you just start ticking away, and then it's not about that you were doing anything wrong. It's just about, well, we're trying to build it for the system, and it may have worked for your organization, but maybe it won't work for the broader the broader sense. And then I guess just having celebrations, that's a big one. So celebrate your success, bring the people that are doing well together, and give everyone a pat on the back. Talk about how wonderful everyone is and what a great job you did. Bring individuals that we've helped house to tell their story, to talk to how the change has impacted them. That's kind of.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Okay. So I have not experienced this as a practitioner, but at HUD, one of the things that we were looking at was the sort of thinking about the homeless response system like you would think about disaster response. And you talked about both, and I'm imagining you were doing both in real time. This was something that we helped to pilot in downtown Seattle, but it's something that's also been, that we've done, that HUD has done in various communities, is really that same approach that you would take. Because I think there's so much pressure on these systems, right? And we've got to move so quickly, and that I think it just feels overwhelming sometimes. But sort of setting this up like it's a disaster response, so that you're meeting every single day, stand-up meetings, you're making commitments, you're making decisions in real time, and you're kind of clearing the path, just like you would do if you were rehousing somebody after an earthquake. I think that's another model that is out there. That's
absolutely
more that short-term
sprint. That is exactly right. That is that's the mentality that we have in Houston because of the fact that we've had so many disasters. That is the approach that we have. Is that and that's how we learned for landlord engagement. When we were dispatched to the disaster shelters, and we were told we have to get everybody out of these disaster shelters, and even though not all of them were homeless, the mayor and the apartment association president put out a call on the news and said, we need any landlords that have units available that would be willing to give us units to house people out of these disaster shelters. Within 24 hours, we had 3,000 apartment units that we put in a spreadsheet. And we were like, why are we not doing this for homelessness? And so after that, we hired a landlord engagement manager, and that is exactly what we did. And so when we started our community COVID housing program at the beginning of the pandemic, we had 600 apartment units ready, and our wait list was turning over and over and over. And so those are, responding, not everyone does. We do, unfortunately, have a lot of disasters in Houston, but that is the kind of the model that we use, yeah.
Sam or Noah, want to close us out on a how? How do we collaborate? How do we change our system?
I was just going to maybe add or supplement this to the fact that there is data, but in my experience, unless there is an emergency, I found collaboration to be more built over shared values, like organizations that have the same approach and the same values, build small and then build on that foundation, as well as data. But I think that a lot of this stuff that we're talking about, the harm reduction and housing as a right, this kind of work is a values-based kind of implementation. And values are not as easy to shift. People have them or don't, and organizations line up that way. But there's also, for me, the collaboration starts between staff and clients. And that's also a kind of a shift, I think, that, people, it's very difficult to do person-centered work because it requires the provider to let go control and experience the anxiety of having someone else make the decisions, which are big decisions about where they're going to live or whether they're going to stop using or not. The consequences are high, and it raises it raises the stakes, and it certainly raises the anxiety level. But I think if you're going to really do this person-centered work, there has to be a different kind of collaboration between providers and clients. That's sort of foundational to this.
Sure. I agree with what's been shared. I think the only thing I would like to add, I think, to this piece about values alignment is also honesty about what it is we are looking to work towards. I find in a lot of conversations I'm in, we are not being fully transparent about the scope of the challenge before us, about the need, and I think we lose a lot of trust when we talk about different interventions that are piecemeal or small in scale, and they might be fine and add value, but we should be honest about where they fit in the system, and that we're not solving homelessness by designing another outreach team. Like we just need to be clear about what we're doing, and if we want buy-in and collaboration, I think we just need to be all starting from the same language and the same assumptions, and we usually don't do that. And the other thing is to not keep people hungry. So maybe with that.
All right, well, one more hand for our panel. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Mercedes. Thank you to our amazing panelists. Thank you to all of you for coming and being here for 4 hours or something. I don't know how long it's been. But there is delicious Mexican food outside, and there's some tables set up out there. There's tables in here. Please feed yourself. 1 second. And I just want to acknowledge, for those of you that are staying for the afternoon, the all-member coalition meeting, we're going to regroup around 1:45. And as a coalition, our first in-person meeting in years, we're going to talk about, reflect on everything we just learned, and talk about how we move forward as a coalition and build power and build change, because we can change, like this whole conversation was about. We can change ourselves. We can be in solidarity that housing is actually a human right, and we can create systems that housing is a human right. So let's do it. Thanks.